Welcome, young wizard, to a tale of friendship forged in the halls of Hogwarts, where four boys would become legends through bonds that even death could not break. Tonight, we journey through the lives of James Potter, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew, the Marauders whose story spans from innocent childhood through heroism, betrayal, and ultimate sacrifice. As you settle into your comfortable bed, let these words carry you through a chronicle of loyalty tested, love discovered, and courage that shaped the wizarding world forever. Close your eyes and drift into this tale of mischief, magic, and the power of true friendship. In the Welsh countryside, where ancient magic flows through valleys carved by time and weathered by countless storms, there stood a cottage that had known both joy and unspeakable terror. The Lupin family home was modest but warm, filled with the gentle light of parents who loved their son more than their own lives. It was a sanctuary of books and laughter, where young Remus John Lupin spent his early years believing that the world was fundamentally good, that monsters existed only in fairy tales, and that his greatest worry would be mastering his letters before his 7th birthday. But darkness has a way of finding innocence, even in the most protected corners of the world. Fenrir Greyback was a werewolf unlike others of his kind, where most lycanthropes sought isolation and struggled against their curse. Greyback embraced the beast within and made it his weapon. He delighted in attacking children, understanding with sadistic precision that young bones would heal crooked, that small hearts would carry the trauma forever, and that families would shatter under the weight of transformation that came with each full moon. The attack came on a night when storm clouds gathered like mourners around the crescent moon, when wind howled through trees that seemed to bend away from something unnatural moving through their branches. 5-year-old Remus had been sleeping peacefully in his small bed, dreaming of the wooden toy soldiers his father had carved for him, when glass shattered somewhere in the cottage, and his mother's scream pierced the darkness like a blade through silk. The memories that remained were fragmentary, nightmare pieces that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Sharp teeth that gleamed silver in moonlight streaming through broken windows. Eyes that burned with intelligence more terrible than mere animal hunger. The weight of something inhuman pressing down on his small chest while claws tore through fabric and flesh with equal ease. The metallic taste of his own blood mixing with saliva that carried a curse older than recorded history. His parents found him minutes later, though it felt like hours to the bleeding child who lay among the ruins of his bedroom. The cottage's protective wards, designed to keep out common threats, had proven useless against something that was neither fully human nor entirely beast. Greyback had vanished into the night, leaving behind only destruction and the slow-acting poison of lycanthropy that would transform their beloved son into the very thing that had attacked him. The healers at St. Mungo's were gentle but honest about what the bite meant. There was no cure for lycanthropy, no magic powerful enough to cleanse the curse from his blood once it had taken hold. The child would transform with every full moon for the rest of his life, becoming a creature driven by instincts that recognized no friendship, acknowledged no love, and sought only to hunt and kill anything that carried a human scent. Remus's parents, Hope and Lyle Lupin, refused to accept that their son's life was over before it had truly begun. They transformed their cottage into a fortress of love and learning, surrounding him with books that would feed his brilliant mind and affection that would anchor his gentle soul. They taught him that he was not defined by the monster that emerged once a month, that his worth lay in the choices he made during the 29 days when he remained entirely human. The transformations began with his first full moon after the attack, and they were everything the healers had warned them to expect. The pain was indescribable, as if his bones were being broken and reformed, while molten metal flowed through his veins. His parents learned to prepare a reinforced room in their basement, warded so heavily that no sound could escape to disturb their neighbors, padded so thoroughly that when the wolf threw itself against the walls in desperate fury, the boy's body would not be damaged beyond healing. They learned the rhythm of lycanthropy as others might learn the changing seasons. 3 days before each full moon, Remus would begin to grow pale and withdrawn, his appetite disappearing as his body prepared for transformation. The night itself was lost to wolf consciousness that remembered nothing but endless, gnawing hunger and the frustration of confinement. The morning after brought exhaustion so complete that he sometimes slept for 15 hours straight, his small body struggling to recover from trauma that no child should endure. But between those terrible nights, Remus flourished in ways that amazed everyone who knew him. His intelligence was remarkable, capable of absorbing information with the hungry efficiency of someone who understood that knowledge was a refuge from things that couldn't be reasoned with or controlled. He devoured books on every subject his parents could provide, from ancient history to advanced mathematics, finding particular comfort in stories of heroes who overcame impossible odds through courage and wisdom, rather than strength or magic. His parents never allowed him to believe that his condition made him less worthy of love or dreams. When other children in the village began to whisper about the strange sounds that came from the Lupin cottage during full moons, Hope and Lyle simply moved their family somewhere new, somewhere their son could have a fresh start without the weight of whispered speculation. They never spoke of his lycanthropy as a shame to be hidden, but as a challenge to be managed, no different from any other medical condition that required ongoing care and accommodation. When his Hogwarts letter arrived on a summer morning that smelled of fresh rain and blooming roses, Remus held it with hands that trembled not from excitement but from disbelief. He had dreamed of attending the legendary school of witchcraft and wizardry, but he had never dared hope that dream might become reality. Surely they would not accept someone like him, someone whose very presence put other students at risk, someone who carried the potential for violence, locked away behind a facade of scholarly gentleness. His father had written immediately to the school's headmaster, explaining their son's condition with clinical honesty that concealed the years of anguish and accommodation that lycanthropy had demanded from their family. They expected rejection, perhaps accompanied by suggestions for correspondence courses or private tutoring that would allow Remus to receive magical education without endangering his peers. Instead, they received a personal visit from Albus Dumbledore himself, arriving at their cottage on an evening when sunset painted the Welsh hills gold and crimson. Dumbledore listened to their concerns with the patience of someone who had spent decades learning that every problem had a solution if one was creative enough to find it. He spoke of secret passages that could provide safe access to isolated areas, of magical trees whose violent nature could protect both the werewolf and the rest of the school, of abandoned buildings that could be transformed into monthly refuges. Most importantly, he spoke of his belief that every child deserved the chance to learn and grow, regardless of the challenges they faced or the fears they carried. The arrangements he proposed were elaborate, but absolutely thorough. The Whomping Willow would be planted on the school grounds, its violent branches making it impossible for curious students to approach the tunnel hidden among its roots. The tunnel would lead to an abandoned house in the nearby village of Hogsmeade, a building that would be reinforced and warded specifically for Remus's monthly transformations. Stories would be spread about the house being haunted, ensuring that villagers would avoid it out of superstitious terror rather than genuine fear. But perhaps most importantly, Dumbledore promised that Remus would not face his challenges alone. The Hogwarts staff would be informed of his condition on a need-to-know basis, providing a network of support and understanding that would help him navigate the social and academic demands of school life. Madame Pomfrey would ensure that his medical needs were met with discretion and compassion. Professor McGonagall would work with him to manage his academic schedule, around the lunar cycle that governed his worst days. The night before he left for Hogwarts, Remus sat in his childhood bedroom surrounded by books that had been his companions through years of isolation and transformation. His trunk was packed with robes that would mark him as a student rather than a victim, with textbooks that would challenge his brilliant mind, with letters from his parents that promised their love would follow him wherever his journey might lead. For the first time in his young life, he was going somewhere that people knew his secret and had chosen to welcome him anyway. The Hogwarts Express gleamed scarlet and gold in the morning sunlight, steam rising from its magnificent engine like incense offered to gods of adventure and possibility. Platform 9 3/4 buzzed with the excited chatter of students returning to school after summer holidays, their voices blending into a symphony of anticipation that made Remus's heart race with emotions too complex to name. He was one of them now, a Hogwarts student preparing for his first year at the greatest magical school in the world. Finding an empty compartment proved challenging on a train filled with returning students who had already established their social groups and claimed their territories. Remus finally settled in a space near the end of the train, sharing it with a round-faced, nervous-looking boy who introduced himself as Peter Pettigrew, with the kind of eager friendliness that suggested he too was grateful for any companionship he could find. Peter chatted constantly about his excitement and terror in roughly equal measures, asking questions about everything from sorting ceremonies to house ghosts with the breathless enthusiasm of someone experiencing magic for the first time. Peter's hero worship was immediate and overwhelming, directed at anyone who showed him even basic kindness or demonstrated abilities that exceeded his own modest talents. He spoke in awed whispers about older students who had performed simple magic tricks, about prefects who had helped him find the correct platform, about anyone who seemed confident and capable in ways that he desperately wished he could emulate. Remus recognized something familiar in Peter's eager gratitude, the relief of someone who had found acceptance after expecting rejection. The boy reminded Remus of a small animal seeking protection from larger predators, instinctively drawn to anyone who might provide safety through association. There was nothing malicious in Peter's behavior, merely the practical recognition that some people were naturally stronger, braver, or more talented, and that aligning himself with such individuals was the most effective strategy for survival in an uncertain world. Remus felt a surge of protective sympathy for this anxious boy who wore his insecurities so openly. Meanwhile, several compartments forward, 2 other first-year students were having a very different experience aboard the Hogwarts Express. James Potter and Sirius Black had been drawn to each other with the magnetic inevitability of 2 forces recognizing their perfect complement. James possessed the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted his worth or questioned his place in the world, while Sirius radiated the rebellious energy of someone determined to forge his own path regardless of family expectations or traditional constraints. They had encountered Lily Evans and Severus Snape sharing a compartment, and what should have been a simple introduction had quickly escalated into the kind of confrontation that would define relationships for years to come. James had heard Snape express his desire to be sorted into Slytherin House, and responded with the thoughtless cruelty that sometimes accompanied absolute self-assurance. His dismissive comment about Slytherin had been intended as casual conversation, but it had carried implications that cut deeper than he realized. Sirius had seized upon James's words with the desperate enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting his entire life for permission to reject everything his family represented. The Black family legacy was built upon Slytherin pride, pure blood supremacy, and the kind of casual cruelty that treated Muggle-born wizards as barely worthy of magical consideration. For Sirius to publicly mock Slytherin House was an act of rebellion that felt like breaking chains that had bound him since birth. Lily Evans had watched this exchange with growing disgust, recognizing the casual privilege that allowed James and Sirius to treat other people's dreams and identities as sources of amusement. Her sharp tongue had defended Snape with the fierce loyalty of someone who understood what it meant to be different, to have your worth questioned by people who had never faced such challenges themselves. Her anger at James was immediate and absolute, establishing a dynamic of mutual antagonism that would persist for years. Severus Snape had absorbed their mockery, with the bitter recognition of someone who had learned early that the world was divided between those with power and those without it. His friendship with Lily was precious precisely because it was rare, a connection that transcended the social barriers that normally separated pure-blood wizards from muggle-born witches. James Potter represented everything that Snape resented about the magical world. All the casual advantages and unearned confidence that came with being born into the right family, with the right connections. When the train finally arrived at Hogsmeade Station, the 4 boys who would become the Marauders were scattered among their fellow first years like seeds waiting for the proper conditions to take root and flourish. Remus helped Peter navigate the chaos of disembarking students, his natural compassion extending toward anyone who seemed overwhelmed by circumstances. James and Sirius continued their animated conversation about Quidditch and pranks, and all the adventures that awaited them at Hogwarts, their friendship already solidifying around shared values and complementary personalities. The Great Hall was everything that legends had promised, and more. Its enchanted ceiling reflecting the star-filled sky above, while candles floated in perfect formation throughout the vast space. The Sorting Hat's song spoke of unity and courage, of the different qualities that each house valued, and the importance of finding your proper place within the school's ancient traditions. But for 4 nervous first years waiting to learn their fate, the ceremony felt less like celebration and more like judgment that would determine the entire course of their magical education. When the Sorting Hat was placed upon Remus Lupin's head, it found a mind that was brilliant, compassionate, and haunted by experiences that had taught him to value kindness above all other virtues. The Hat sensed his intelligence and considered Ravenclaw, recognized his loyalty and pondered Hufflepuff, but ultimately detected the quiet courage that had enabled him to survive transformation after transformation while maintaining his essential humanity. Gryffindor would provide him with the friendships that could help him bear his burden, the Hat decided, and Gryffindor would benefit from his gentle wisdom and scholarly dedication. Peter Pettigrew's sorting took longer, the Hat struggling to identify defining characteristics in someone whose primary trait was adaptability to whatever environment he found himself occupying. There was loyalty in Peter, certainly, but it was loyalty born from dependence rather than principle. There was intelligence, but it was practical rather than academic, focused on survival rather than knowledge for its own sake. Ultimately, the Hat recognized that Peter belonged wherever he could find the acceptance and protection he craved, and Gryffindor's emphasis on bravery might encourage him to develop courage that was currently more potential than reality. James Potter's sorting was swift and decisive, the Hat barely touching his dark hair before declaring him a perfect fit for Gryffindor. Here was someone who embodied every quality the house treasured, from natural leadership to instinctive courage, to the kind of confidence that inspired others to follow his example. His magical ability was considerable. His heart was fundamentally good despite his occasional arrogance, and his potential for heroism was written in every fiber of his being. Sirius Black's sorting created a moment of suspended silence throughout the Great Hall, as students and faculty alike recognized the historical significance of what was unfolding. No Black family member had been sorted into any house other than Slytherin for generations, and the family's reaction to such a betrayal would undoubtedly be swift and severe. But the hat sensed in Sirius the same rebellious courage that had driven him to reject his family's values, the same determination to forge his own path that would make him a natural fit for Gryffindor's tradition of standing against darkness regardless of personal cost. The four boys found themselves seated together at the Gryffindor table, bound by nothing more than house affiliation and the natural tendency of first years to cluster together for comfort and companionship. They shared the feast that welcomed them to Hogwarts, listening to older students tell stories about professors and traditions, and the countless adventures that awaited them in the castle's ancient halls. None of them suspected that they had just been placed at the beginning of a journey that would transform them from frightened children into legends whose names would echo through magical history. But somewhere in the castle's towers, Albus Dumbledore watched the new students with eyes that had learned to see potential even in the most unlikely circumstances. He observed Remus Lupin's careful interactions with his housemates, recognizing the social skills that would allow him to navigate school life despite his terrible secret. He noted James Potter and Sirius Black's immediate friendship, seeing in their bond the kind of loyalty that could either create heroes or unleash chaos depending on how it was guided and developed. The first night in Gryffindor Tower was filled with the nervous excitement of boys who were away from home for the first time, sharing a dormitory with strangers who would become their closest companions for the next 7 years. They exchanged tentative stories about their families and backgrounds, each revealing just enough to establish basic friendships while carefully guarding the secrets they weren't ready to share. Remus spoke vaguely about his parents' work and his love of reading. James boasted about his Quidditch skills and his determination to make the house team. Sirius hinted at family conflicts without providing details that might reveal the depth of his rejection of pure-blood ideology, and Peter expressed his excitement about finally belonging somewhere that would appreciate his magical abilities. As they settled into their 4-poster beds surrounded by curtains that provided the illusion of privacy, none of them could have imagined the bonds that would form between them over the coming years. They were just 4 boys beginning their magical education, each carrying secrets and dreams and fears that would gradually be revealed through shared experiences and growing trust. The foundation of the Marauders had been laid in a dormitory conversation that lasted until dawn, but their legend would be built through adventures, challenges, and the kind of friendship that transforms ordinary people into something extraordinary. The castle settled into sleep around them, its ancient stones humming with protective magic that had watched over students for nearly 1,000 years. In their dormitory high in Gryffindor Tower, 4 future legends slept peacefully, unaware that they had just begun a journey that would take them from innocent childhood through heroism and tragedy, from the safety of school corridors to battlefields where their courage would be tested against the darkest forces the wizarding world had ever known. The mystery of Remus Lupin's monthly disappearances began to reveal itself slowly, like shadows retreating before the gradual approach of dawn. During their first year at Hogwarts, his 3 roommates had accepted his occasional absences with the casual indifference of children who had more pressing concerns than tracking each other's whereabouts. But as their second year progressed and their friendship deepened, James Potter, Sirius Black, and Peter Pettigrew began to notice patterns that transformed mild curiosity into genuine worry. It was always the same rhythm, as predictable as the changing seasons, but far more mysterious in its implications. Once each month, usually during a period of 3 or 4 days, Remus would grow, increasingly pale and withdrawn, his normally voracious appetite disappearing entirely while dark circles appeared beneath his eyes like bruises painted by invisible hands. He would claim illness with elaborate stories about family emergencies, dying relatives, or chronic conditions that required specialized treatment far from the school's ancient walls. His excuses were creative, and delivered with the desperate sincerity of someone who understood that discovery would mean the end of everything he had come to cherish about his life at Hogwarts. He spoke of his mother's recurring illness that required his immediate presence, of aging grandparents who lived in remote locations where owls couldn't reach them with regular correspondence, of family obligations that were too complex and personal to explain to friends who had grown up in different circumstances entirely. But James possessed the kind of observational skills that came from years of studying Quidditch strategies and reading the intentions of opposing players, while Sirius had been trained from birth to detect deception in the subtle political maneuvering that characterized pure-blood family interactions. Peter might have been slower to grasp academic concepts, but his survival instincts made him acutely aware of changes in the people he depended upon for protection and acceptance. Together, they formed an investigative team that was far more formidable than any individual inquiry could have been. They began to track the timing of his absences with the methodical patience of students who had learned that magic followed rules even when those rules weren't immediately obvious. The pattern that emerged was so clear that it seemed impossible they hadn't noticed it earlier. Remus disappeared during the full moon, every single time, without fail or variation. He would leave the castle on the evening when the moon was brightest and return 2 or 3 days later, looking exhausted and often bearing mysterious injuries that he attributed to accidents or clumsiness. The realization came to them simultaneously during a late-night conversation in their dormitory, when James casually mentioned that Remus had been gone during the last full moon, and Sirius added that the same thing had happened the month before that, and Peter quietly confirmed that his careful observations had revealed the same pattern extending back to the beginning of the school year. The silence that followed was heavy with implications that none of them wanted to voice aloud, but the truth was inescapable once the evidence had been assembled and analyzed. Werewolves transformed during the full moon. Remus disappeared during the full moon. The logical conclusion was as terrifying as it was undeniable, forcing them to confront the reality that their friend and roommate was afflicted with one of the most feared and stigmatized conditions in the entire wizarding world. They sat in their beds, staring at each other through the darkness, processing information that transformed everything they thought they knew about someone they had come to love as deeply as a brother. The initial reaction was confusion rather than fear or revulsion, because lycanthropy was something they had learned about in defense against the dark arts classes as an abstract magical condition, rather than a reality that could affect people they actually knew and cared about. The textbooks spoke of werewolves as dangerous creatures who lost all human consciousness during transformation, becoming mindless predators driven by insatiable hunger for human flesh and blood. But Remus was gentle and intelligent, more likely to help struggling students with their homework than to harm anyone through word or deed. James was the first to voice what they were all thinking, his characteristic directness cutting through the uncertainty that had paralyzed their conversation. If Remus truly was a werewolf, then he was facing his transformations entirely alone, locked away somewhere on the school grounds, while his body underwent changes that were described in their textbooks as excruciatingly painful and psychologically traumatic. The thought of their friend enduring such suffering in isolation was more than any of them could bear to contemplate. Sirius immediately declared that they needed to confront Remus directly, his impulsive nature demanding action rather than continued speculation. But Peter, with the survival instincts that had served him well throughout his life, cautioned that approaching their friend with such accusations might drive him away entirely if their suspicions proved incorrect. They needed more evidence, he argued, and they needed to approach the situation with the kind of careful planning that would preserve their friendship regardless of what truth they ultimately discovered. Their investigation took on the intensity of a military campaign, with each of them assigned specific responsibilities for gathering intelligence about Remus's mysterious absences. James used his growing reputation as a Quidditch prodigy to gain access to areas of the castle that were normally restricted to students, exploring the grounds for hidden locations where transformations might take place safely. Sirius employed the charm and social connections that came naturally to someone from his background, cultivating relationships with older students who might have insights into the school's deepest secrets. Peter proved unexpectedly valuable as an investigator, his small size and unremarkable appearance allowing him to observe and listen without drawing attention to himself. He learned to position himself near conversations between professors, to linger in corridors where important discussions might take place, to gather fragments of information that individually meant nothing but collectively painted a picture of elaborate accommodations being made for a student whose needs went far beyond ordinary educational support. The breakthrough came when Peter overheard Madame Pomfrey discussing with Professor McGonagall the need to prepare special medical supplies for a student whose monthly condition required immediate care following periods of extreme physical trauma. The conversation was conducted in the kind of careful euphemisms that adults used when discussing sensitive topics, but the implications were clear to anyone who had already formed suspicions about lycanthropy and full moon patterns. They learned about the Whomping Willow from older students who spoke of it as one of Hogwarts' newest and most dangerous additions, a tree that had been planted during their first year with branches that moved independently and struck with enough force to break bones or cave in skulls. The official explanation was that it had been added to the grounds as a protective measure, but no one could explain exactly what it was meant to protect against, or why such extreme measures had been necessary. Sirius discovered the existence of the Shrieking Shack through conversations with students from Hogsmeade who spoke in whispers about the most haunted building in all of Britain, a structure that was avoided even by the bravest villagers due to the violent sounds that emerged from it during certain nights each month. The timing of the supernatural disturbances matched perfectly with Remus's absences, and the description of screams and howls that seemed to come from something in unbearable agony painted a picture that confirmed their worst fears about their friend's monthly ordeal. James used his natural leadership skills to coordinate their investigation, ensuring that their individual discoveries were compiled into a comprehensive understanding of the elaborate measures that had been put in place to accommodate a student whose transformation required absolute isolation from the rest of the Prains school population. The tunnel that connected the Whomping Willow to the Shrieking Shack became obvious once they understood what they were looking for, a secret passage that allowed safe transport from the castle grounds to a reinforced location where lycanthropic transformation could occur without endangering other students. The truth, when finally assembled from weeks of careful investigation, was both exactly what they had expected and far more heartbreaking than any of them had imagined. Remus was indeed a werewolf, condemned to undergo transformation once each month in complete isolation, while his friends remained safely in their dormitory, believing whatever cover story he had provided for his absence. The Shrieking Shack was his prison, and the sounds that terrified villagers were his cries of agony as his human body was reshaped into something monstrous and alien. But understanding the truth created a new problem that none of them had anticipated during their investigation. What were they supposed to do with knowledge that could destroy their friend's life if it became public, but which also explained suffering that they desperately wanted to help alleviate? The stigma associated with lycanthropy was so severe that discovery would result in immediate expulsion from Hogwarts and virtual exile from wizarding society, condemning Remus to a life of poverty and isolation that would make his current struggles seem insignificant by comparison. The decision to confront their friend required courage that went beyond anything their Gryffindor training had prepared them for, because they were choosing to risk a friendship that had become central to all of their lives at Hogwarts. If they were wrong about their conclusions, Remus would be hurt and offended by their suspicions. If they were right, but he wasn't ready to share his secret, Their knowledge might drive him away from the only real friendships he had ever experienced. But if they remained silent, they would be abandoning him to face his terrible burden alone, when their support might make all the difference in his ability to cope with his condition. James took the lead in the conversation, approaching Remus with the same directness that characterized all of his interactions, but tempered with unusual gentleness that acknowledged the sensitivity of what they were about to discuss. They waited until they had complete privacy in their dormitory, drawing the curtains around one of the 4-poster beds to create an intimate space where secrets could be shared without fear of accidental discovery by other students or wandering professors. The moment when they revealed their knowledge was perhaps the most terrifying of Remus's young life, surpassing even his memories of Greyback's attack, because this threat was directed at his heart rather than merely his body. He sat frozen while his 3 closest friends explained what they had discovered and how they had reached their conclusions, waiting for the inevitable reaction of revulsion and rejection that would confirm his worst fears about the impossibility of maintaining normal relationships while carrying such a terrible secret. But instead of backing away in horror or demanding that he be removed from their dormitory for their own safety, James, Sirius, and Peter surprised him with a response that demonstrated the depth of friendship that had developed between them over nearly 2 years of shared experiences. They weren't horrified by his lycanthropy, but heartbroken by the thought of him enduring his transformations in complete isolation, and they were determined to find ways to provide the support and companionship that could make his terrible burden more bearable. Their immediate reaction was to research everything they could discover about lycanthropy, not from the perspective of defense against dark creatures, but from the viewpoint of friends seeking to understand and assist someone they cared about deeply. They learned about the physical and psychological trauma associated with transformation, about the loneliness and social isolation that typically accompanied the condition, about the ways that emotional support could help lycanthropes maintain their human identity, even while their bodies underwent monthly metamorphosis. The revelation that werewolves were only dangerous to humans opened up possibilities that none of them had initially considered, suggesting that there might be ways to provide companionship during transformation without creating unacceptable risks for everyone involved. If they could somehow become animals during Remus's wolf nights, they could offer him the social interaction that might make the difference between transformation being a nightmare to be endured alone, and an experience that could be shared with friends who refused to abandon him to his fate. The idea of becoming Animagi was so audacious that it initially seemed more like fantasy than achievable goal. But research in the Hogwarts library revealed that the magical transformation was theoretically possible for wizards with sufficient skill and determination. The process was complex and dangerous, requiring years of study and practice, but it offered the tantalizing possibility of friendship that could transcend the species barrier that normally separated humans from the werewolves they became. Sirius threw himself into the research with the passionate intensity that characterized everything he approached, driven by a combination of genuine concern for Remus and excitement at the prospect of mastering magic that was far beyond anything they were supposed to attempt as second-year students. James contributed his natural leadership and organizational skills, creating study schedules and practice routines that would allow them to make steady progress toward their goal while maintaining their regular academic performance. Peter, despite his usual academic struggles, proved surprisingly dedicated to mastering material that would help his friend, finding reserves of motivation and perseverance that he rarely displayed in other subjects. The theory behind Animagus transformation was rooted in the deepest principles of transfiguration magic, requiring not just technical skill, but psychological integration that allowed a wizard's consciousness to adapt to radically different physical forms while maintaining essential human identity and memory. They had to learn to visualize their animal forms with perfect clarity, understanding not just their appearance but their instincts, behaviors, and sensory experiences in enough detail to successfully inhabit bodies that operated according to entirely different biological principles. The preliminary exercises were frustrating and often painful, involving meditation techniques that were supposed to help them identify their natural animal forms through introspection and magical sensitivity. James discovered his affinity for stag transformation through dreams of running through forests with antlers that could part tree branches and hooves that could cover vast distances without fatigue. Sirius connected with dog consciousness through his natural loyalty and pack instincts, finding that canine form felt like a natural extension of his existing personality rather than an alien transformation. Peter struggled more than his friends with the visualization exercises, his animal form remaining elusive and uncertain even after months of dedicated practice. The breakthrough came when he stopped trying to become something impressive or powerful, and instead embraced the practical advantages of small size and inconspicuous appearance that had served him well throughout his human life. Rat form offered abilities that perfectly complemented his survival instincts, providing access to spaces that larger animals couldn't reach and stealth capabilities that would prove essential to their eventual success. The first successful partial transformations occurred during their 4th year, when years of theoretical study and visualization practice finally began to produce physical results that proved the feasibility of their ambitious plan. James managed to sprout antlers during a particularly intense practice session, feeling them emerge from his skull with sensations that were more strange than painful. Sirius achieved temporary paw transformation that allowed him to experience enhanced senses of smell and hearing that revealed previously unimaginable layers of environmental information. But partial success brought new challenges that forced them to confront the real dangers associated with animagus transformation. The magic was so complex and demanding that mistakes could result in permanent disfigurement or death, leaving them trapped between forms or transformed into creatures that retained animal instincts but lost human consciousness. They needed supervision and guidance from someone with expertise in advanced transfiguration, but seeking help would require revealing their true purpose and potentially exposing Remus's secret to additional people who might not be as understanding or discreet. Professor McGonagall became their unwitting mentor through advanced transfiguration classes that challenged them to master techniques that were normally reserved for 7th-year students or adult wizards seeking specialized certification. She noticed their exceptional progress and unusual dedication without understanding the personal motivations that drove them to excel in her subject above all others, attributing their success to natural talent and competitive spirits that pushed them to outperform their classmates. The breakthrough that finally allowed complete transformation came during their 5th year, when years of preparation and practice culminated in magical achievement that surpassed anything their professors expected from students their age. James's first complete transformation into stag form was accomplished in the privacy of their dormitory during a night when the moon was dark and Remus was sleeping peacefully in his own bed, unaware that his friends were testing magic that could revolutionize his relationship with lycanthropy. The sensation of inhabiting stag consciousness was unlike anything James had ever experienced, combining human awareness with instincts and sensory capabilities that belonged to an entirely different species. He could smell emotions in the air around him, hear conversations taking place several rooms away, feel the pulse of life in every growing thing throughout the castle grounds. But most importantly, he retained his human memories and emotional connections, understanding exactly why he had chosen this form and what he hoped to accomplish through its mastery. Sirius achieved dog transformation several weeks later, discovering that canine form felt so natural to his personality that he sometimes wondered if he had been born into the wrong species entirely. His enhanced senses revealed layers of information about his environment that human perception could never access, while pack instincts that had always been part of his human nature found perfect expression through four-legged form that was designed for loyalty and protective companionship. Peter's rat transformation was the most difficult to achieve, but ultimately the most essential to their plan, because his small size would allow him to approach the Whomping Willow's base and locate the mechanism that could freeze its violent branches long enough for his friends to pass safely through. The psychological adjustment to rodent form was challenging for someone who already struggled with feelings of inadequacy and insignificance, but the practical advantages were undeniable once he learned to embrace capabilities that perfectly complemented his existing skills. Their first attempt to join Remus during transformation was planned with military precision that reflected their understanding of the enormous risks involved for everyone concerned. They waited until a full moon night, when weather conditions were favorable, when professors were unlikely to be patrolling the grounds, and when their friend's transformation cycle was predictable enough to ensure they could find him in wolf form, rather than during the painful transition periods that preceded and followed his lycanthropic episodes. The journey from Gryffindor Tower to the Whomping Willow required every stealth skill they had developed through years of nocturnal adventures and rule-breaking expeditions throughout the castle. James's invisibility cloak concealed all three of them until they reached the grounds, where they transformed into animal form and relied on enhanced senses and natural camouflage to avoid detection by anyone who might be watching for unusual activity. Peter's approach to the Whomping Willow was perhaps the most dangerous part of their entire plan, requiring him to navigate between branches that moved with lethal speed and force, while locating a specific knot in the trunk that would trigger the tree's dormancy mechanism. His rat form allowed him to scurry between the spaces where larger creatures would be crushed. But the margin for error was essentially zero, and the consequences of failure would have been instantly fatal. The tunnel beneath the Whomping Willow was exactly what their research had led them to expect, a passage that had been excavated and reinforced specifically to provide safe transport between the castle grounds and the Shrieking Shack, during monthly periods when such access was essential. The journey through complete darkness was accomplished through enhanced animal senses that revealed details their human eyes could never have perceived, following a path that led inexorably toward the sounds of movement and distress that indicated Remus's location. The Shrieking Shack itself was a testament to the elaborate measures that had been taken to accommodate lycanthropic transformation while protecting both the affected student and the surrounding community. The interior had been stripped of anything that could be used as weapons or tools for escape, while the walls and floors had been reinforced with magic that could contain even the most violent struggles of a creature determined to break free from confinement. Their first sight of Remus in wolf form was simultaneously heartbreaking and terrifying, revealing a creature that combined their friend's familiar features with predatory characteristics that belonged to an entirely different species. The wolf paced restlessly throughout the confined space, throwing itself against walls and doors with desperate energy that spoke of intelligence trapped within a body governed by alien instincts and driving hungers. But their presence as fellow animals created an immediate change in the wolf's behavior that validated everything they had hoped to accomplish through their years of dedicated preparation. The aggressive pacing ceased as enhanced canine senses detected the presence of creatures that were neither prey nor threat, but something unprecedented in the wolf's experience. The isolation that had defined every previous transformation was broken by companionship that allowed lycanthropic instincts to be channeled into social interaction rather than destructive solitude. James's stag form provided the strength and size necessary to engage with the werewolf as an equal, establishing pack dynamics that satisfied the wolf's need for social hierarchy, while ensuring that more vulnerable members of their group remained protected from predatory instincts that could never be entirely suppressed. Sirius's dog consciousness connected most naturally with lycanthropic psychology, offering the kind of play behavior and mutual grooming that wolves use to establish and maintain social bonds. Peter's contribution was less obvious but equally essential, his small size allowing him to monitor the wolf's emotional state and provide early warning if predatory instincts began to overcome social recognition. His rat form also offered the werewolf a natural prey target that could be pursued and captured without causing actual harm, channeling hunting instincts into harmless play that satisfied biological drives without endangering anyone. The transformation of Remus's monthly ordeal from nightmare endured in isolation to adventure shared with devoted friends was perhaps the greatest gift that friendship had ever offered to someone carrying such a terrible burden. The wolf's violent struggles against confinement were replaced by exploration and play behavior that allowed lycanthropic energy to be channeled into positive social interaction rather than destructive attempts to escape or self-harm. But even more importantly, the human consciousness that remained aware during transformation was no longer completely alone with thoughts and memories that had always made his wolf nights exercises in psychological torture. The presence of friends who had chosen to share his burden meant that transformation became an experience of connection rather than isolation, proof that their friendship was strong enough to transcend the species barrier that separated human from lycanthrope. The morning after their first successful companionship during transformation brought emotional revelations that none of them had anticipated, as Remus woke to discover not only that his friends knew his deepest secret, but that they had dedicated years of their lives to ensuring he would never face it alone again. The gratitude he felt was beyond anything that words could express, encompassing not just relief at finally being able to share his burden, but amazement that anyone would consider him worthy of such extraordinary sacrifice and dedication. Their success during the first shared transformation encouraged them to expand their adventures beyond the confines of the Shrieking Shack, using their animal forms to explore areas of the castle grounds and surrounding countryside that were normally forbidden to students. The werewolf's enhanced senses and physical capabilities, combined with their own animal abilities, allowed them to discover hidden places and secret passages that had been forgotten by generations of previous students and staff. These nocturnal expeditions during full moon nights became the most treasured memories of Remus's time at Hogwarts, experiences that transformed his relationship with lycanthropy from source of shame and isolation to foundation for adventures that he could never have imagined as an ordinary human student. Running through moonlit forests with friends who had chosen to become animals in order to share his experience was a form of acceptance that transcended anything that normal friendship could offer. But their adventures also involved risks that grew more significant as they became bolder in their explorations and more confident in their ability to control lycanthropic behavior through pack dynamics and social interaction. There were near misses when the wolf's predatory instincts overwhelmed social recognition, moments when Remus's human consciousness helplessly watched his animal body, preparing to attack friends who trusted him completely, despite the dangers they faced by remaining in his presence. James's leadership skills proved essential during these crisis moments. His stag form providing the authority and physical presence necessary to redirect werewolf aggression before it could result in tragedy. Sirius's intuitive understanding of pack psychology allowed him to recognize warning signs and adjust their group behavior to diffuse tensions before they escalated into violence. Peter's survival instincts kept him positioned safely throughout their adventures while remaining close enough to provide assistance if emergencies developed. The nicknames that emerged from their shared experiences reflected both their animal forms and their roles within the group that had formed around supporting Remus through his monthly transformations. Moony acknowledged his lycanthropic condition while emphasizing the way that moonlight had become associated with friendship rather than lonely suffering. Prongs captured James's majestic stag antlers and his role as the group's natural leader. Padfoot reflected Sirius's dog form and his loyal, protective nature. Wormtail described Peter's rat transformation while recognizing his essential contribution to their collective success. Their adoption of the name Marauders reflected their growing reputation for nighttime adventures and rule-breaking expeditions that had expanded far beyond their original purpose of supporting Remus during transformations. They were becoming legendary among their fellow students for their knowledge of secret passages, their ability to move throughout the castle without detection, and their talent for elaborate pranks that demonstrated magical creativity and thorough understanding of Hogwarts' hidden geography. But beneath their reputation for mischief and adventure lay the deeper truth that they had formed a bond of friendship that was strong enough to overcome any obstacle, including the most stigmatized condition in the entire wizarding world. Their willingness to become illegal Animagi in order to provide companionship during lycanthropic transformation was proof that true friendship recognized no boundaries and acknowledged no limitations when it came to supporting the people they loved. The knowledge they gained through their nocturnal explorations would eventually become the foundation for their greatest collaborative magical achievement, a map that would preserve their discoveries for future generations of students who shared their appetite for adventure and their willingness to challenge arbitrary restrictions on their freedom to explore their magical education to its fullest extent. The golden years of mischief began in earnest during their 6th year at Hogwarts, when 4 young wizards who had mastered the art of transformation decided that the castle's ancient secrets were meant to be explored rather than simply acknowledged and avoided. The successful integration of lycanthropic companionship into their monthly routine had given them confidence that no magical challenge was beyond their capabilities if they approached it with sufficient planning, dedication, and collaborative effort. What had started as a desperate mission to support their friend had evolved into something approaching a calling, a systematic exploration of everything Hogwarts had to offer beyond its official curriculum. Their nocturnal adventures during full moon nights had revealed tantalizing glimpses of hidden passages and forgotten chambers that suggested the castle contained far more mysteries than any student guidebook had ever documented. Ancient corridors that led to rooms not marked on any official map, staircases that moved according to patterns more complex than simple rotation, doorways concealed behind tapestries and portraits that recognized passwords lost to centuries of accumulated secrecy. Each discovery raised new questions about the full scope of Hogwarts' magical architecture and the purposes served by spaces that seemed designed for activities that official records had never acknowledged. James Potter's natural leadership had been refined through their collaborative efforts into something approaching military precision, his ability to coordinate complex operations enhanced by practical experience with timing, logistics, and risk management that most students would never encounter during their academic careers. He understood instinctively how to balance individual strengths against collective objectives, how to distribute responsibilities in ways that maximized each person's contributions while minimizing their exposure to dangers that exceeded their capabilities. His role as the group's strategic planner was supported by tactical gifts that had been honed through countless hours of Quidditch practice and competition, where split-second decisions could determine victory or defeat, and where understanding your teammates' capabilities was as important as mastering your own skills. The same spatial awareness that made him deadly accurate with a quaffle and uncannily gifted at reading opposing team formations, served him well when navigating the castle's complex geography and anticipating the movement patterns of professors who might interrupt their unauthorized explorations. Sirius Black's contribution went beyond his dog form's enhanced senses to encompass psychological insights that had been developed through years of navigating the treacherous social dynamics of pure-blood family politics. His understanding of how people thought and what motivated their behavior made him invaluable for predicting which areas of the castle would be monitored most carefully and which routes would offer the greatest probability of avoiding detection by authority figures who might disapprove of student activities that violated official restrictions. His rebellious nature, which had initially manifested as simple rejection of family expectations, had matured into a sophisticated understanding of how rules functioned within institutional structures and where those rules might be challenged without triggering consequences that would compromise their ability to continue their explorations. He possessed an intuitive grasp of the difference between harmless rule-bending and genuinely dangerous violations that could result in expulsion or criminal charges. Remus Lupin brought intellectual capabilities that transformed their adventures from random wandering into systematic investigation, his scholarly instincts ensuring that every discovery was documented and analyzed for its broader implications regarding the castle's history and magical properties. His natural curiosity about how things worked extended beyond textbook knowledge to encompass genuine fascination with the practical applications of magic that had been implemented by generations of witches and wizards who had lived and worked within Hogwarts walls. His monthly transformations had given him a unique perspective on the castle's hidden geography, as his enhanced lupine senses revealed details about magical emanations and structural modifications that normal human perception could never detect. Areas that appeared mundane to ordinary observation often contained subtle magical signatures that suggested hidden purposes or concealed mechanisms that warranted further investigation by students with sufficient skill and determination to uncover their secrets. Peter Pettigrew's rat form remained essential for accessing spaces that his larger friends couldn't reach, but his contribution extended beyond simple reconnaissance to include the kind of patient observation that revealed patterns in professor movement and security protocols that more impulsive personalities might overlook. His natural tendency toward careful analysis of potential threats made him invaluable for identifying risks that could compromise their operations before those risks materialized into actual dangers. His hero worship of his more talented friends had evolved into genuine expertise in areas that complemented their obvious strengths, particularly in understanding how their individual capabilities could be combined most effectively to overcome challenges that none of them could handle alone. He had become the group's specialist in practical logistics, ensuring that their ambitious plans were supported by sufficient attention to details that could determine success or failure. Their exploration of the castle's hidden passages began with systematic mapping of routes they had discovered during full moon expeditions, but gradually expanded to encompass deliberate searches for additional secrets that might be revealed through careful observation and magical analysis. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated concealed doorways, hidden staircases, and passages that had been sealed or abandoned but could potentially be reopened by students with sufficient knowledge of the magical techniques that had been used in their construction. The discovery of the passage that connected Hogwarts directly to Honeyduke's sweet shop in Hogsmeade Village was perhaps their greatest triumph of systematic investigation, revealing a route that had been forgotten by current faculty, but remained perfectly functional for students bold enough to use it. The tunnel stretched for nearly a mile beneath the Scottish Highlands, protected by preservation charms that had maintained its structural integrity through centuries of disuse and concealed by concealment magic that made its entrances virtually invisible to casual observation. But the Honeyduke's Passage was merely one of 7 secret routes between the castle and the village that their methodical exploration eventually revealed, each offering different advantages in terms of concealment, travel time, and accessibility under various weather conditions. Some emerged directly into village buildings, while others terminated in natural features like caves or abandoned structures that required additional navigation to reach populated areas, but offered greater security against accidental discovery. The passage through the Whomping Willow remained their most frequently used route during full moon nights, but they discovered that the tree's violent nature served a dual purpose as both protection for Remus's transformations and camouflage for a tunnel that provided access to Hogsmeade during ordinary circumstances when lycanthropic considerations weren't relevant. Peter's ability to navigate the tree's defensive branches made this route exclusively their own, as no other students possessed the specific combination of skills and knowledge necessary to bypass its magical guardianship. Their exploration of Hogsmeade during unauthorized visits revealed a village that was far more complex and interesting than the sanitized environment that official school trips presented to properly supervised students. The shops and taverns that remained open during evening hours served clientele whose conversations provided insights into adult wizarding concerns that were rarely discussed in academic settings, while the village's connections to magical communities throughout Scotland offered glimpses of the broader world that awaited them after graduation. These nocturnal adventures through village streets taught them practical skills in stealth and observation that complemented their magical education, with real-world experience in moving through populated areas without drawing unwanted attention from authorities who might question their right to be present during unofficial hours. They learned to blend into crowds, to position themselves where they could observe and listen without being noticed, and to extract information from conversations without revealing their own interests or identities. But perhaps more importantly, their unauthorized explorations of both castle and village provided them with a comprehensive understanding of the magical environment they inhabited that far exceeded anything available through official channels. They knew every secret passage, every hidden room, every concealed entrance that connected Hogwarts to the wider world. This knowledge would prove invaluable throughout their remaining years at school and beyond, forming the foundation for achievements that would become legendary among students and staff alike. The creation of the Marauders map represented the culmination of 4 years' worth of exploration and discovery, a magical artifact that would preserve their accumulated knowledge for future generations while demonstrating their mastery of cartographic magic that challenged the skills of professional mapmakers. The project required not just geographical accuracy, but magical innovation that could capture and display information that changed constantly as people moved throughout the castle's complex 3-dimensional space. The technical challenges involved in creating such a comprehensive magical map were enormous, requiring them to develop new techniques for spatial tracking that could identify and display the locations of everyone within the castle, regardless of whether they were attempting to remain hidden or were protected by magical concealment. They needed to create enchantments that could distinguish between humans and animals, between students and staff, between authorized visitors and potential intruders who might pose security risks. The map's ability to reveal people's exact locations in real time required magical innovations that pushed the boundaries of what individual students should have been capable of achieving, combining divination techniques with cartographic magic and surveillance spells in ways that professional magical researchers would have considered ambitious for graduate-level projects. They were essentially creating a magical artifact that could see through walls, detect invisible people, and track movements throughout one of the most magically protected buildings in the wizarding world. James's contribution to the map's development centered on the leadership and coordination skills that kept such a complex collaborative project moving toward completion, despite the enormous technical challenges they encountered along the way. His understanding of how their individual strengths could be combined most effectively ensured that each person's efforts contributed to the overall objective, rather than pursuing separate goals that might conflict or duplicate each person's efforts. Others' work. Sirius brought artistic sensibilities that transformed the map from a purely functional tool into something approaching a work of art, with decorative elements and visual flourishes that reflected their personalities while maintaining the practical clarity necessary for navigation purposes. His understanding of pure-blood family traditions included knowledge of magical cartography techniques that had been developed by aristocratic families for managing large estates and tracking the movements of family members and servants. Remus provided the theoretical foundation that made their ambitious project feasible, his scholarly research revealing the magical principles that govern spatial tracking and real-time display of information that changed constantly throughout each day and night. His systematic approach to problem-solving ensured that they understood not just how to create the magical effects they desired, but why those effects worked and how they could be modified or enhanced to meet their specific requirements. Peter's contribution was perhaps the most essential. Despite being less obvious than his friend's more dramatic talents, his patient attention to detail, ensuring that every passage, every room, every staircase was accurately represented and properly connected to create a map that would actually function for navigation, rather than merely displaying impressive magical effects. His rat form allowed him to verify the accuracy of their cartographic work by physically traveling through areas that were represented on the map and confirming that the magical representation matched geographical reality. The process of enchanting the map to display people's locations required them to develop magical signatures that could identify specific individuals while maintaining their privacy and dignity in ways that prevented the map from being used for genuinely harmful surveillance or stalking. They wanted to create a tool that would help students navigate the castle and avoid unwanted encounters with authority figures, not a weapon that could be used to violate people's reasonable expectations of privacy or safety. The security measures they built into the map's design reflected their understanding that such a powerful magical artifact could be misused if it fell into the wrong hands, requiring authentication procedures that would prevent unauthorized users from accessing its capabilities, while ensuring that legitimate users could operate it efficiently. The activation phrase, "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good," captured their mischievous spirit while serving as a password that would be meaningless to anyone who didn't understand their approach to unauthorized adventures. The concealment command, "Mischief Managed," served dual purposes as both deactivation procedure and philosophical statement about their approach to rule-breaking activities that were intended to enhance their education rather than cause genuine harm to people or property. They understood that their adventures existed in a grey area between harmless fun and serious violations of school regulations, and they wanted their map to reflect that understanding through security measures that demonstrated responsibility despite their rebellious activities. The map's ability to insult users who attempted to access it without proper authorization reflected Sirius's sense of humor while serving practical security functions that would discourage casual attempts to discover its secrets. The magical personalities they programmed into the map were extensions of their own characters, ensuring that even when they weren't present to defend their creation, it would respond to threats and inappropriate use in ways that reflected their values and priorities. The first successful activation of the completed map was a moment of triumph that validated years of collaborative effort and demonstrated magical achievement that exceeded anything their professors expected from students their age. Seeing their combined knowledge displayed in comprehensive detail, watching dots that represented people moving throughout the castle in real time, confirmed that they had created something genuinely unprecedented in the history of Hogwarts student projects. But the map's true value became apparent through practical use during subsequent adventures, when its capabilities allowed them to navigate the castle with confidence that they could avoid unwanted encounters while pursuing objectives that might otherwise have been impossible to achieve safely. They could monitor the movements of professors whose patrol routes might intersect with their planned activities, identify areas that were temporarily unoccupied and therefore available for exploration, and track the locations of fellow students whose presence might complicate their unauthorized expeditions. The map transformed them from students who relied on luck and timing to avoid detection into tactical operators who could plan their activities with military precision, understanding exactly where potential obstacles were located and how to navigate around them most effectively. This enhanced capability allowed them to attempt increasingly ambitious adventures that would have been impossible without such comprehensive intelligence about their environment. Their reputation for nocturnal adventures and elaborate pranks grew throughout their remaining years at Hogwarts, as fellow students recognized that the Marauders possessed knowledge and capabilities that set them apart from ordinary rule breakers who relied on impulse and crude magical techniques. They became legends among their peers for their ability to appear anywhere in the castle without warning, to disappear when pursuit seemed inevitable, and to accomplish seemingly impossible feats of mischief that demonstrated magical creativity and thorough understanding of Hogwarts' hidden geography. The professors' reactions to their activities reflected a mixture of frustration and grudging admiration for students, whose rule-breaking demonstrated exceptional magical ability and collaborative planning skills that suggested they were learning valuable lessons despite their refusal to confine themselves to official educational parameters. Professor McGonagall's exasperated fondness for their achievements was typical of faculty responses that recognized their talent, while deploring their tendency to apply it in unauthorized ways. But beneath the surface entertainment value of their pranks and adventures lay deeper achievements that would serve them well throughout their lives beyond Hogwarts. They had learned to work together as a team whose combined capabilities exceeded the sum of their individual talents, to plan and execute complex operations under challenging conditions, to adapt quickly when circumstances changed unexpectedly, and to support each other through difficulties that tested their friendship and determination. Their mastery of the castle's hidden geography provided them with psychological confidence that came from knowing they could navigate any challenge their environment might present, while their collaborative achievements in magical innovation demonstrated that they could accomplish objectives that seemed impossible when approached through official channels. These lessons would prove invaluable when they eventually faced challenges that were far more serious than school regulations and authority figures who disapproved of unauthorized student activities. The bonds between them had been strengthened through shared adventures and collaborative achievements that created memories they would treasure for the rest of their lives, regardless of whatever challenges and tragedies might await them in the adult world. Beyond Hogwarts' protective walls, they had learned that friendship could overcome any obstacle, that loyalty could transcend any difficulty, and that four people who truly understood and supported each other could accomplish things that none of them could achieve alone. Their final years at Hogwarts were marked by increasingly sophisticated pranks and adventures that demonstrated magical maturity while maintaining the playful spirit that had always characterized their approach to unauthorized activities. They understood that they were approaching the end of an era, that graduation would separate them and force them to face adult responsibilities that would leave less time for the kind of elaborate mischief that had defined their school years. But they also understood that the knowledge and skills they had developed through their collaborative adventures would serve them well regardless of whatever careers and challenges awaited them after leaving Hogwarts. They had learned to think creatively, to work effectively as a team, to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, and to maintain loyalty to each other despite difficulties that might test their friendship. These lessons would prove more valuable than any academic subject they had studied in official classes. The map they had created would outlive their time at Hogwarts, eventually falling into the hands of future students who would use it to continue the tradition of unauthorized exploration and creative mischief that the Marauders had established. But more than a practical tool for navigation and surveillance, the map represented a philosophy about education that emphasized curiosity, collaboration, and the willingness to challenge arbitrary restrictions on learning and discovery. Their legacy at Hogwarts extended far beyond any individual prank or adventure to encompass a fundamental approach to magical education that valued practical experience alongside theoretical knowledge, that understood friendship as the foundation for achievement that transcended individual limitations, and that recognized mischief as a legitimate form of creative expression when it was pursued with appropriate consideration for other people's welfare and dignity. The golden years of their friendship would end with graduation and the adult responsibilities that awaited them in a wizarding world that was growing darker and more dangerous with each passing month. But the memories they had created together, the skills they had developed through collaboration, and the bonds they had forged through shared adventures would remain with them always, providing strength and comfort during trials that would test everything they believed about loyalty, courage, and the power of friendship to overcome impossible odds. The transformation of James Potter from arrogant show-off to someone worthy of Lily Evans's affection was neither sudden nor simple, but rather a gradual evolution that unfolded over years of small moments and growing self-awareness that eventually revealed the man he had always been capable of becoming. His obsession with the brilliant, fierce-tempered redhead had begun during their very first encounter aboard the Hogwarts Express, when her defense of Severus Snape had demonstrated a moral courage that both impressed and intimidated him in ways he was too young to fully understand. Throughout their early years at Hogwarts, James's attempts to gain Lily's attention had been characterized by increasingly elaborate displays of magical prowess and social dominance that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of what actually attracted someone with her values and intelligence. He would ruffle his already untidy black hair whenever he spotted her across the Great Hall or in the corridors, a nervous habit that had developed from his certainty that appearing windswept and casual would make him seem more appealing to someone who obviously valued authenticity over pretension. The golden snitch that he carried everywhere during his 5th and 6th years became both his signature prop and the symbol of everything that was wrong with his approach to courtship, representing his belief that impressive displays of athletic skill and reflexes could compensate for personality defects that ran far deeper than simple immaturity. He would release the struggling golden ball during conversations, letting it fly several feet before snatching it from the air with movements that were genuinely spectacular, but also, obviously, calculated to draw attention to abilities that had nothing to do with the qualities that made someone worth knowing and loving. His friends watched these performances with mixture of amusement and exasperation, understanding that James's intentions were genuine, even when his methods were counterproductive to the point of being actively harmful to his romantic prospects. Sirius would occasionally suggest more subtle approaches that might appeal to someone of Lily's intelligence and moral sensitivity, while Remus attempted to explain why showing off and bullying other students might not be the most effective way to win the heart of someone who obviously valued kindness and fairness above all other virtues. But James's competitive nature and natural confidence had been reinforced by years of success in every area of his life, where effort and talent could guarantee positive results, leaving him unprepared for the reality that matters of the heart followed entirely different rules than Quidditch matches or academic examinations. He had never encountered a challenge that couldn't be overcome through superior performance, and his inability to understand why his obvious superiority in magical ability and athletic achievement didn't automatically translate into romantic success frustrated him in ways that made his behavior even more problematic. Lily Evans represented everything that James had never had to work for and couldn't simply take by virtue of his natural advantages and family connections. She was brilliant in her own right, more gifted in certain areas of magic than he was, despite coming from a non-magical background that should have put her at a disadvantage compared to someone raised in the wizarding world from birth. Her moral clarity and unwavering principles made her immune to the kind of social pressures that might have influenced other students to overlook his flaws in favor of his obvious assets and promising future prospects. Her rejection of his advances was absolute and uncompromising, delivered with the kind of cutting honesty that left no room for hope or self-deception about where he stood in her estimation of worthwhile human beings. She found his arrogance repulsive, his treatment of other students morally inexcusable, and his assumption that she should be impressed by magical displays and athletic achievements insulting to her intelligence and values. When she told him that she would rather date the giant squid that lived in the Great Lake than spend an evening in his company, she meant every word with the fervor of someone whose patience had been exhausted by years of unwanted attention. The incident that would become known throughout Hogwarts as Snape's worst memory occurred during the spring of their 5th year, when the pressures of upcoming examinations and the general stress of adolescence combined to create circumstances that brought out the worst in everyone involved. James had been showing off near the lake after their defense against the dark arts examination, surrounded by students who were enjoying the warm weather and freedom from academic responsibilities that always followed the completion of major testing periods. Severus Snape's presence in the same general area was enough to trigger James's competitive instincts and desire to demonstrate his superiority in front of an audience that included the object of his romantic obsession. The fact that Lily was present to witness whatever confrontation might develop made the situation irresistible to someone whose understanding of courtship was based on primitive notions about displaying dominance and physical prowess that might have been appropriate for medieval tournaments, but had no place in civilized society. The attack on Snape was unprovoked and disproportionate, beginning with magical disarmament that left him defenseless, and escalating to public humiliation that was designed to establish James's superiority, while entertaining their audience at the expense of someone who had done nothing more threatening than exist in the same general area. The levitation charm that hoisted Snape into the air by his ankle was accompanied by jeers and laughter from students who were caught up in the mob mentality that often accompanied such displays of casual cruelty. But James had seriously miscalculated both his audience and the likely consequences of his actions, failing to understand that someone like Lily Evans would be disgusted rather than impressed by behavior that revealed the darkest aspects of his character. Her intervention on Snape's behalf was immediate and furious, her moral outrage directed at James with the full force of her considerable personality and magical ability. She didn't see a popular, talented student defending his social position, but a bully using his advantages to torment someone who couldn't fight back effectively. The confrontation that followed would haunt James for years afterward, as Lily's words cut through his self-image and forced him to confront truths about his behavior that he had been avoiding through rationalization and self-deception. When she told him that he made her sick, that his arrogance and cruelty were disgusting, that she could never respect someone who treated other people the way he treated Severus Snape, she was speaking with the authority of someone whose moral judgment he had learned to value even when it was directed against him. Snape's response to Lily's defense was perhaps even more devastating than her rejection of James's character, as his use of the word mudblood revealed that years of friendship and loyalty meant less to him than his wounded pride and social embarrassment. The slur was unforgivable in its implications, reducing Lily's worth to her blood status, and aligning Snape with the very forces of prejudice and hatred that were growing stronger throughout the wizarding world with each passing month. James's offer to leave Snape alone if Lily would agree to date him was perhaps the most tone-deaf moment in a confrontation that was already damaging his reputation beyond repair, demonstrating that he still didn't understand why his behavior was morally objectionable, rather than simply tactically ineffective. He was treating her defense of an innocent victim as a bargaining chip in his romantic campaign, proving that his obsession with winning her affection was more important to him than understanding why she found his actions reprehensible. Her response that she wouldn't go out with him if it was a choice between him and the giant squid was delivered with the kind of contemptuous finality that should have ended his romantic pursuit forever, making it clear that she didn't just dislike his current behavior, but found his entire approach to relationships fundamentally offensive. She wasn't rejecting a specific action, but a pattern of thinking that revealed character flaws that went far deeper than simple immaturity or social awkwardness. The aftermath of this public humiliation should have taught James valuable lessons about the consequences of bullying and the importance of treating all people with basic dignity and respect, but his immediate reaction was to escalate rather than reflect, continuing his assault on Snape with even greater viciousness as a way of compensating for his romantic failure. The threat to remove Snape's underwear in front of their gathered audience was the act of someone whose judgment had been completely overwhelmed by embarrassment and wounded pride. But somewhere beneath his defensive anger and social posturing, James was beginning to understand that Lily's rejection wasn't based on arbitrary preferences or temporary mood, but on fundamental incompatibility between his values and hers that could only be addressed through genuine personal growth rather than more impressive displays of magical ability or athletic achievement. Her words had revealed truths about his character that he couldn't dismiss or rationalize away, forcing him to confront the possibility that he had been pursuing someone who was simply too good for him in ways that had nothing to do with talent or social status. The conversation with Sirius that followed his humiliation provided some comfort, but also reinforced the growing realization that his approach to winning Lily's affection had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Sirius's observation that she thought he was conceited was accurate but incomplete, failing to capture the depth of her moral objection to behavior that she saw as indicative of character flaws that made him unsuitable as a romantic partner, regardless of his other positive qualities. The summer that followed their 5th year was a period of reflection and growth that began James's transformation from someone who demanded respect based on his natural advantages to someone who understood that respect had to be earned through consistent demonstration of good character and moral courage. His separation from the Hogwarts environment allowed him to gain perspective on his behavior and its consequences, without the daily pressure of maintaining his social position among peers who expected him to continue playing the role of confident leader and popular student. Sirius's arrival at the Potter family home during this period provided both emotional support and practical demonstration of the kind of courage that James was beginning to recognize as truly admirable, as his best friend's decision to reject his family's pure-blood supremacist ideology represented the kind of moral clarity that Lily Evans valued above all other virtues. Watching Sirius choose principles over comfort and safety gave James a model for the kind of person he wanted to become, someone whose actions were guided by genuine convictions rather than social expectations or personal advantage. The welcome that James's parents extended to Sirius revealed family values that had shaped James's fundamental character, even when his behavior didn't reflect the lessons they had tried to teach him about treating all people with dignity and respect. Their willingness to treat his best friend as a second son, providing emotional and financial support without expecting anything in return, demonstrated the kind of generosity and acceptance that James was beginning to understand as the foundation for relationships based on genuine affection rather than calculated advantage. The conversations between James and Sirius during those summer months allowed both of them to process the implications of their fifth-year experiences and plan approaches to their final years at Hogwarts that would reflect greater maturity and understanding of their responsibilities as leaders within their house and school community. They began to recognize that their popularity and influence carried obligations to set positive examples for younger students who looked up to them and emulated their behavior. James's decision to transform his approach to school relationships was motivated by genuine recognition that his previous behavior had been morally wrong, rather than simply tactically ineffective in winning Lily's romantic attention. He began to understand that the casual cruelty he had directed towards students like Severus Snape was symptomatic of character flaws that needed to be addressed, regardless of their impact on his romantic prospects, because treating other people badly was inherently wrong rather than just counterproductive to his personal goals. The beginning of their 7th year at Hogwarts revealed changes in James's behavior that were immediately apparent to everyone who had known him during his more arrogant phase, though the transformation was gradual enough to suggest genuine personal growth, rather than calculated manipulation designed to improve his social image. He stopped carrying the golden snitch everywhere, recognizing that such obvious attempts to draw attention to his Quidditch abilities were beneath someone who should be secure enough in his worth to let his actions speak for themselves. His hair remained as untidy as ever, but he stopped the automatic ruffling gesture whenever he encountered Lily in corridors or common rooms, understanding that such obvious displays of nervousness were inappropriate for someone who claimed to respect her intelligence and independence. Instead, he began treating her with the kind of casual friendliness that acknowledged their shared experiences and mutual respect, without carrying the undertones of romantic pursuit that had made their previous interactions uncomfortable for both of them. The appointment to head boy came as a surprise to James himself, who had never been selected as a prefect and whose disciplinary record contained enough rule violations to make such recognition seem unlikely at best. But Dumbledore's choice reflected his understanding that leadership potential was often found in students who had learned important lessons through their mistakes, rather than those who had never faced serious challenges to their moral development. Lily's appointment as head girl created circumstances that forced them to work together on practical projects that required cooperation and mutual respect, rather than the competitive dynamic that had characterized their previous relationship. Their shared responsibilities for younger students' welfare and school discipline gave them common ground that allowed genuine friendship to develop naturally without the pressure and awkwardness that had marked James's previous romantic pursuit. The gradual change in Lily's attitude toward James was based on her observation of behavioral changes that couldn't be dismissed as temporary performance designed to win her approval, but represented fundamental shifts in his priorities and values that addressed her previous objections to his character. She began to notice that he intervened when he witnessed bullying behavior, that he used his influence to protect vulnerable students rather than to enhance his own social status, that he treated everyone with basic courtesy regardless of their house affiliation or social background. His continued antagonism towards Severus Snape was perhaps the last vestige of his previous immaturity, but even these confrontations became less frequent and less vicious as James learned to channel his competitive instincts into more constructive outlets than public humiliation of someone he had always viewed as a rival. The hexing that continued between them was now mutual rather than one-sided, with Snape proving quite capable of defending himself and retaliating in ways that made their conflicts more like dueling practice than bullying sessions. Lily's growing respect for James's transformation was evident in small changes in their daily interactions, as she began seeking his opinion on head student responsibilities and including him in conversations about topics that went beyond their official duties. She started laughing at his jokes, a significant change from her previous dismissive responses to his attempts at humor, and began treating him as someone whose company she genuinely enjoyed, rather than someone whose attention she merely tolerated out of politeness. The moment when their relationship shifted from friendship to romance was so gradual that neither of them could identify exactly when it happened. But by the spring of their 7th year, they were spending increasing amounts of time together in circumstances that had nothing to do with their official responsibilities as head students. Their conversations became more personal and intimate, revealing aspects of their personalities and backgrounds that they had never shared with other people. James learned about Lily's experiences growing up in the Muggle world, her initial wonder at discovering magic, her struggles with the prejudice that some students directed toward Muggle-born witches and wizards, and her determination to prove that blood status had nothing to do with magical ability or personal worth. Her stories helped him understand perspectives that his privileged background had never forced him to consider, broadening his awareness of the challenges faced by people whose circumstances were different from his own. Lily discovered that James's confidence and natural leadership masked insecurities and vulnerabilities that he rarely allowed other people to see, that his competitive nature was balanced by genuine concern for his friends' welfare, and that his loyalty to people he cared about was absolute and unwavering. She began to appreciate qualities that had always been present, but had been overshadowed by the arrogance and immaturity that had characterized his earlier behavior. Their first kiss occurred during a late evening when they were working together on head student responsibilities in the empty common room, surrounded by paperwork and planning documents that suddenly seemed far less important than the realization that their friendship had evolved into something deeper and more meaningful. The moment was natural and unhurried, free from the pressure and desperation that had marked James's previous romantic pursuit, representing the culmination of months of gradual recognition that they were genuinely compatible in ways that went far beyond physical attraction. The reaction of their friends to this romantic development reflected the various perspectives they brought to relationships and personal growth, with Sirius expressing satisfaction that his best friend had finally won the affection of someone who was obviously worthy of such dedication, while Remus observed that both James and Lily seemed happier and more relaxed now that they had stopped fighting the attraction that had been building between them throughout their years at Hogwarts. Peter's response was perhaps the most telling, as his hero worship of James now extended to include admiration for his success in winning someone who was widely regarded as one of the most intelligent and desirable students in their year. His comments revealed his assumption that romantic success was another form of achievement that demonstrated James's overall superiority, missing the deeper significance of personal growth that had made the relationship possible. But even Peter recognized that James's relationship with Lily represented something more meaningful than simple romantic conquest, as the changes in his friend's behavior and priorities were obvious to anyone who had known him during his more self-centered phase. James had become someone who was genuinely concerned with other people's welfare, who used his abilities and advantages to help rather than dominate, who had learned to value collaboration over competition in areas where cooperation served everyone's interests more effectively. The final months of their Hogwarts education were characterized by an atmosphere of growing tension, as news from the wider wizarding world suggested that the dark forces they had learned about in defense against the dark arts classes were gaining strength and influence beyond the school's protective boundaries. Voldemort's name was being whispered with increasing frequency, and graduates were facing a future that seemed far more dangerous and uncertain than previous generations had encountered upon leaving school. The knowledge that they would soon be forced to make choices about their roles in a conflict that was rapidly escalating beyond anything they had been prepared for added urgency to relationships and friendships that might soon be tested by circumstances that would challenge everything they believed about loyalty, courage, and moral responsibility. The bonds they had formed during their school years would either be strengthened by adversity or broken by pressures that academic life had never imposed upon them. James and Lily's relationship deepened as they recognized that their future together would require the kind of commitment and mutual support that could survive challenges far more serious than adolescent misunderstandings or social awkwardness. They began making plans that extended beyond graduation, discussing careers and goals that assumed they would face whatever difficulties awaited them as partners, rather than individuals pursuing separate paths through an increasingly dangerous world. The graduation ceremony itself was bittersweet, marking the end of what they all recognized had been the happiest and most carefree period of their lives, when their greatest concerns had been examinations and house competitions rather than life and death struggles against forces that threatened everything they valued about the wizarding world. The friendships they had formed and the lessons they had learned would either prove sufficient for the challenges ahead, or they would discover that the protected environment of Hogwarts had failed to prepare them for realities that no academic curriculum could have addressed adequately. As they left the castle for the final time as students, the four Marauders understood that their adventures and discoveries had been preparation for trials that would test not just their magical abilities, but their fundamental character and commitment to principles that were easy to maintain during peacetime but far more difficult to uphold when maintaining them required genuine sacrifice and courage. The golden years of mischief and friendship were ending, but the bonds they had forged would either sustain them through the darkness ahead or be revealed as insufficient for challenges that would demand everything they had learned about loyalty, love, and the cost of standing against evil. The transition from Hogwarts students to adult members of wizarding society occurred during one of the most dangerous periods in magical history, when the comfortable certainties of academic life gave way to harsh realities that demanded choices between safety and principle, between personal happiness and collective responsibility. The four Marauders emerged from their protected educational environment into a world where the dark forces they had studied in defense against the dark arts classes were no longer theoretical threats, but immediate dangers that challenged everything they believed about justice, loyalty, and the price of maintaining freedom against overwhelming opposition. The Order of the Phoenix represented everything that their Gryffindor education had prepared them to embrace: a secret organization dedicated to fighting evil regardless of personal cost and committed to protecting innocent people who couldn't protect themselves against enemies, whose ruthlessness and magical power exceeded anything that peacetime society had been designed to counter. Albus Dumbledore's invitation to join this resistance movement was both honor and burden, recognizing their potential while acknowledging that such potential would inevitably be tested under circumstances that could destroy anyone who wasn't absolutely committed to the cause. James Potter's acceptance of Order membership was immediate and enthusiastic, his natural leadership instincts finding perfect expression in an organization that valued courage above comfort and demanded action rather than passive observation of evil's steady advance throughout wizarding society. His aura training had provided him with combat skills and tactical knowledge that complemented his instinctive understanding of how to inspire others during moments when fear and despair threatened to overcome determination and hope. His marriage to Lily Evans represented more than romantic fulfillment, but a deepening of commitment to values that transcended personal happiness, as their partnership was forged in circumstances that demanded sacrifice and mutual support in service of principles larger than their individual desires. Their wedding ceremony was conducted under the shadow of war, surrounded by friends who understood that such celebrations might be among the last moments of joy they would experience before the conflict's outcome was finally determined. Sirius Black stood beside his best friend as best man during a ceremony that celebrated not just the union of two people who had found love despite their differences, but the triumph of personal growth over past mistakes and character flaws that had once seemed insurmountable. His presence in that role represented his own journey from rebellious teenager to adult who had learned to channel his rejection of family values into positive action rather than mere defiance of authority and tradition. The relationship between Sirius and James had evolved beyond schoolboy friendship into something approaching brotherhood, forged through shared adventures that had tested their loyalty and strengthened their understanding of each other's strengths and limitations. Their bond would prove essential during the dangerous missions that Order membership required, providing the kind of implicit trust and coordination that could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure when facing enemies who showed no mercy to the captured or wounded. Remus Lupin's participation in the Order represented a form of acceptance that he had never dared hope for during his isolation-marked childhood and adolescence, as Dumbledore's organization valued his unique capabilities while acknowledging his condition without the prejudice and fear that characterized most of wizarding society's response to lycanthropy. His scholarly intelligence and analytical abilities made him invaluable for planning operations that required thorough understanding of enemy psychology and tactical capabilities. His monthly transformations, which had once been sources of shame and social isolation, became tactical advantages that allowed him to gather intelligence from werewolf communities that Voldemort was actively recruiting with promises of equality and acceptance that mainstream wizarding society had never offered. These missions required him to maintain cover identities that were psychologically challenging, pretending sympathy for dark causes, while gathering information that could save innocent lives. Peter Pettigrew's involvement in the Order reflected his lifelong pattern of seeking protection through association with more powerful individuals. Though initially his motivations appeared to align with his friend's genuine commitment to fighting evil and protecting the innocent, his rat animagus form provided capabilities that were essential for surveillance and infiltration missions, allowing him to observe enemy activities in circumstances where human agents would be immediately detected and eliminated. But Peter's commitment to the cause was based more on loyalty to his friends than on independent moral conviction, making him vulnerable to pressures and temptations that might eventually overwhelm his desire to remain worthy of their friendship and protection. His hero worship of stronger personalities created psychological dependencies that could potentially be exploited by enemies who understood how to manipulate people whose self-worth was based on external validation rather than internal principles. Lily Potter's contribution to the Order extended far beyond her exceptional magical abilities to encompass the kind of moral clarity and unwavering principle that provided inspiration during moments when the cost of continued resistance seemed too high to bear. Her Muggle-born background gave her perspectives on the conflict's broader implications that pure-blood wizards sometimes failed to grasp, understanding that Voldemort's victory would mean not just political domination, but the systematic destruction of everything that made magical society worth preserving. Her work as a member of the Order required her to balance her natural compassion with the harsh realities of warfare against enemies who recognized no boundaries between combatant and civilian, who used torture and murder as routine tools of intimidation and control. The psychological toll of such work was enormous, forcing her to maintain hope and humanity while regularly witnessing evidence of evil that challenged her fundamental beliefs about human nature and the possibility of redemption. The missions that the Order undertook during this period ranged from intelligence gathering and rescue operations to direct combat against Death Eater forces that were growing bolder and more vicious with each passing month. The enemy's tactics evolved beyond simple terrorism to include psychological warfare designed to break the will of anyone who might consider resistance, using public displays of cruelty to demonstrate the futility of opposing Voldemort's consolidation of power. The prequel adventure that involved James and Sirius being pursued through London streets on the famous flying motorcycle represented the kind of operation that had become routine for Order members, though the specific details of their mission remained classified even among their closest friends and family. The chase by Muggle police officers provided cover for their real purpose, which likely involved either gathering intelligence about Death Eater activities or disrupting enemy operations in ways that couldn't be officially acknowledged by the Ministry of Magic. Sirius's flying motorcycle had become legendary among Order members for its speed and maneuverability, enhanced through magical modifications that pushed the boundaries of what was considered safe or practical for aerial transportation. The bike represented his rejection of pure-blood traditions that favored elegant but impractical transportation methods, embracing Muggle technology that could be enhanced through magic to create capabilities that neither approach could achieve independently. The Death Eaters, who pursued them, represented a new generation of Voldemort's followers, younger and more ruthless than the original supporters who had been motivated primarily by pure blood supremacist ideology. These new recruits were attracted by the promise of power and the opportunity to inflict suffering on people they viewed as inferior, making them more dangerous because their commitment was based on sadistic pleasure rather than misguided political beliefs that might be challenged through reason or evidence. The magical combat that occurred during their escape demonstrated techniques and strategies that had been developed specifically for the kind of three-dimensional warfare that characterized conflicts between flying opponents, where traditional dueling methods were inadequate for circumstances that required split-second decisions while maneuvering at high speeds through complex environments. James and Sirius had become experts in such combat through Order training and practical experience that few wizards their age possessed. The successful completion of their mission, whatever its specific objectives might have been, represented the kind of victory that kept Order morale intact during a period when defeats and casualties were becoming increasingly common. Each successful operation proved that Voldemort's forces were not invincible, that careful planning and exceptional skill could overcome superior numbers and resources when applied by people who were absolutely committed to their cause. The intelligence networks that Remus had helped establish within werewolf communities began providing crucial information about Voldemort's recruitment efforts and strategic planning, revealing the scope of his ambitions and the timeline for operations that could potentially devastate wizarding society if they weren't prevented through preemptive action. This intelligence came at enormous personal cost to Remus, who was forced to associate with creatures whose lycanthropy had driven them to embrace violence and hatred as expressions of their rejection by mainstream society. The psychological stress of maintaining cover identities while gathering such intelligence required Remus to suppress his natural compassion and scholarly instincts, pretending to share attitudes and values that were fundamentally opposed to everything he believed about the possibility of coexistence between magical and non-magical peoples. The information he gathered was invaluable, but obtaining it required him to witness planning for atrocities that he couldn't prevent without compromising his cover and endangering future intelligence operations. The birth of Harry James Potter represented hope and vulnerability in equal measure, bringing joy to James and Lily during one of the darkest periods in wizarding history, while creating new responsibilities and concerns that complicated their involvement in dangerous Order missions. Their son represented the future they were fighting to protect, but his existence also made them targets for enemies who understood that attacking family members was often more effective than direct confrontation with trained fighters. Sirius's appointment as Harry's godfather reflected the depth of trust and affection that existed between the Marauders, acknowledging his role as more than friend, but as someone who could be relied upon to provide protection and guidance if circumstances required it. The responsibility was both honor and burden, as it implied obligations that might require him to sacrifice his own interests for the welfare of someone he loved as deeply as family. The godparent relationship also reflected James and Lily's understanding that their participation in the war created risks that extended beyond their own lives to encompass their son's future welfare and safety. Sirius represented continuity of values and relationships that would ensure Harry's upbringing reflected the principles they had fought to defend, even if they weren't present to provide such guidance personally. The Order's operations became increasingly desperate as Voldemort's power grew and his followers became more numerous and better organized, transforming from scattered terrorist cells into something approaching a conventional military force with clear command structure and strategic objectives that extended beyond simple intimidation to encompass actual conquest of magical society. The resistance that Dumbledore had organized was being overwhelmed by enemies whose resources and ruthlessness exceeded anything they had been prepared to counter. Peter's gradual psychological deterioration during this period reflected the enormous stress that Order membership imposed on people who lacked the deep personal commitment that sustained their more dedicated colleagues through periods of loss and apparent futility. His increasing anxiety and paranoia were initially attributed to normal responses to dangerous circumstances, but they actually represented the beginning of a moral collapse that would eventually lead to consequences far more devastating than anyone could have anticipated. The hero worship that had always characterized Peter's relationships with his more talented friends was being eroded by fear that their cause was hopeless and that continued association with prominent Order members was more likely to result in death than victory. His rat animagus form, which had once been a source of pride as evidence of his ability to contribute meaningfully to their shared adventures, became a reminder of his fundamental insignificance in conflicts where individual survival depended on capabilities that he simply didn't possess. The psychological techniques that Voldemort and his followers used to recruit new supporters were sophisticated and targeted, identifying potential converts who could be approached through their fears and insecurities rather than their ideological convictions. Peter's obvious vulnerability made him an attractive target for manipulation by enemies who understood that turning trusted insiders against their former allies was often more valuable than eliminating them directly. The gradual process of Peter's betrayal began with seemingly innocent contacts that provided him with opportunities to preserve his own life, while ensuring that his friends remained unaware of his growing doubts about their cause and his willingness to consider alternatives that might offer better prospects for survival. These initial contacts allowed him to rationalize his eventual complete defection as unavoidable response to circumstances, rather than deliberate choice to abandon principles and betray people who trusted him absolutely. The intelligence that Peter began providing to Voldemort's forces was initially limited and seemingly insignificant, consisting of information about Order operations that appeared routine and unlikely to result in serious consequences for his friends and colleagues. But even these minor betrayals established patterns of communication and collaboration that made more serious violations of trust seem like natural progressions rather than fundamental shifts in loyalty and moral commitment. The psychological transformation that allowed Peter to justify his betrayal of lifelong friends involved complex rationalization that portrayed Voldemort as inevitable victor whose triumph would ultimately benefit everyone by ending a conflict that was causing unnecessary suffering and destruction. He convinced himself that providing intelligence to the winning side would actually protect his friends by ensuring that their defeat would be swift and relatively merciful rather than prolonged and catastrophically destructive. But beneath these elaborate justifications lay simpler and more disturbing truths about Peter's character and the limitations of loyalty that was based on dependence rather than genuine moral commitment. His lifelong pattern of seeking protection through association with powerful individuals had finally led him to conclude that Voldemort represented superior power and therefore better prospects for survival than continued alliance with friends whose cause appeared increasingly hopeless. The Order's growing awareness that they were being betrayed by someone with access to highly classified information created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that further weakened their effectiveness, while making every operation more dangerous for participants who couldn't be certain that their plans hadn't been revealed to enemies who would be waiting to ambush them. The knowledge that a traitor existed within their ranks was almost as damaging as the actual intelligence that was being provided to Voldemort. The investigation into the source of security breaches proved inconclusive because the traitor was someone whose access to sensitive information was legitimate and whose behavior hadn't changed in ways that would attract suspicion from people who had known him for years. Peter's skill at concealing his true feelings and motivations had been developed through years of hiding his insecurities and inadequacies behind facades of loyalty and dedication that his friends had never questioned. The prophecy that identified Harry Potter as potential threat to Voldemort's continued existence transformed what had been a general conflict into a specific struggle for the life of an infant whose survival might determine the prophecy's ultimate outcome of the war. The knowledge that their son had been marked for death by the most powerful dark wizard in history forced James and Lily to make decisions about their future that prioritized Harry's safety above their own welfare and continued participation in Order operations. The Fidelius charm that was proposed as protection for the Potter family represented magic at its most advanced and powerful, creating concealment that was theoretically absolute, but which required trust in a secret keeper whose loyalty had to be beyond question. The choice of who would hold such responsibility carried implications that extended far beyond simple friendship to encompass life and death decisions that could determine not just their own fate but the entire war's outcome. The original plan to make Sirius the secret keeper was logical given his history of absolute loyalty and his willingness to sacrifice everything for people he loved, but his suggestion that Peter would be a less obvious choice reflected tactical thinking that prioritized strategic surprise over personal preference. The decision represented their collective assessment that Voldemort would focus his efforts on corrupting or eliminating Sirius, while ignoring Peter as insufficiently important to warrant serious attention. The switch in Secret Keepers was accomplished in absolute secrecy, with only the 4 people directly involved understanding that the apparent arrangements were actually elaborate deception, designed to protect the real Secret Keeper from detection and attack. The strategy might have succeeded if Peter's loyalty had been genuine, creating security through misdirection that would have confused enemies until it was too late to prevent the Potter family's successful concealment. But Peter's betrayal transformed their clever tactical deception into a trap that delivered exactly the intelligence that Voldemort needed to locate and attack his primary targets, while ensuring that Dumbledore and other Order leaders would be unable to provide assistance because they had been deliberately kept ignorant of the true arrangements. The very secrecy that should have protected the Potter family instead guaranteed that their betrayal would be complete and devastating. The final weeks before Voldemort's attack on Godric's Hollow were characterized by preparations and precautions that reflected their understanding that they were entering the most dangerous phase of a conflict that had already cost too many lives and destroyed too many families. James and Lily made arrangements for Harry's care that assumed they might not survive the war, while continuing to hope that their sacrifice might contribute to ultimate victory over forces that threatened everything they valued about the magical world. Their letters to friends and family during this period revealed people who understood the risks they were facing while refusing to abandon hope that love and courage might ultimately prove stronger than hatred and fear. The bonds they had forged during their years at Hogwarts had been tested by war and proven strong enough to sustain them through trials that peacetime friendship could never have endured, though those bonds were about to face their ultimate test in circumstances that would reveal the true character of everyone involved. The trust they placed in Peter as their secret keeper represented more than tactical decision, but affirmation of friendship that had survived 7 years at Hogwarts and the dangerous early phases of the war against Voldemort. Their faith in his loyalty would prove tragically misplaced, but their willingness to entrust their lives to someone they had always protected and supported demonstrated the kind of generosity and trust that made them worthy of the sacrifice that was about to be demanded of them. The Fidelius charm that would seal the Potter family's fate was cast on a grey October evening when autumn mist hung heavy over the village of Godric's Hollow, obscuring the ancient cottages where generations of witches and wizards had lived and died in peaceful anonymity. The magic that Dumbledore performed was among the most complex and powerful protective spells in existence, weaving concealment so complete that the hidden location would become literally unthinkable to anyone who had not been directly told its whereabouts by the designated secret keeper. James and Lily Potter stood in their cozy sitting room, watching through diamond-paned windows as their neighbours went about evening routines that seemed impossibly normal, given the circumstances that had driven them into hiding. The cottage, that had been their sanctuary for the past months, was about to become either their salvation or their tomb, protected by magic that had never been broken but which required absolute trust in someone whose loyalty would determine whether they lived to see their son's second birthday. The final preparations for the charm's implementation were conducted with the solemnity appropriate for a ritual that would either preserve their family or deliver them directly into the hands of enemies who had already demonstrated their willingness to torture and kill anyone who stood between Voldemort and his objectives. Harry played contentedly among his toys, unaware that his parents were taking measures that represented their last hope of keeping him safe from a prophecy that had marked him for death before his second year of life. Peter Pettigrew arrived at the cottage just as twilight was settling over the valley, his nervous energy and obvious anxiety attributed by his friends to natural concern for their welfare, rather than the psychological turmoil of someone who was about to commit the most heinous betrayal in the history of their friendship. His rat animagus form had allowed him to approach the house without being detected by the various magical monitoring systems that the Order had established around the village, though such precautions seemed unnecessary given their confidence in the protection that the Fidelius charm would provide. The ceremony itself was surprisingly brief for magic of such enormous complexity and power, requiring little more than Dumbledore's spoken incantation and Peter's formal acceptance of responsibility for safeguarding the secret that would determine the Potter family's survival. The magical energy that surrounded them during the casting was barely perceptible to normal senses, but those present could feel reality shifting around them as the cottage and its occupants began to fade from ordinary perception. Sirius Black remained unaware of the deception that his suggestion had made possible, believing that he carried the burden of protecting his best friends through his own reliability and resistance to enemy pressure. His willingness to serve as decoy, secret keeper, demonstrated the kind of selfless courage that had always characterized his friendship with James, accepting enormous personal risk in order to draw Voldemort's attention away from the real protector of the Potter family's hiding place. The weeks that followed Peter's acceptance of secret keeper responsibilities were marked by an atmosphere of relative calm that felt almost surreal. After months of constant vigilance and escalating danger, James and Lily began to hope that they might actually survive the war, that their son might grow up knowing his parents rather than simply their memory, that the friendships forged during their Hogwarts years might endure long enough to share stories of their adventures with the next generation. But Peter's psychological state during this period was deteriorating rapidly as the weight of his intended betrayal combined with growing fear of discovery by either side in the conflict. His communications with Voldemort's representatives had intensified beyond simple intelligence sharing to include detailed planning for an assault that would ensure the Dark Lord's victory, while eliminating witnesses who might reveal Peter's role in arranging his friends and Peter's destruction. The intelligence that Peter provided about the Potter family's daily routines, magical defenses, and emergency procedures was comprehensive and deadly accurate, gleaned from years of friendship and recent weeks of close observation as their supposed protector. He revealed the times when Harry was most likely to be sleeping peacefully in his crib, when James and Lily were most likely to be relaxed and unprepared for sudden attack, when the cottage's magical defenses were configured for normal residential protection rather than active combat readiness. Voldemort's preparations for the assault on Godric's Hollow reflected his understanding that this attack represented more than simple murder, but the fulfillment of prophecy that had identified the Potter infant as the greatest threat to his continued existence and ultimate conquest of the wizarding world. The Dark Lord approached the mission with unusual personal attention to details that he normally delegated to subordinates, recognizing that failure to eliminate Harry Potter might result in consequences that could undermine everything he had accomplished. The magical preparations for penetrating the cottage's defenses required techniques that pushed the boundaries of what even Voldemort considered acceptable risks, combining dark magic with experimental spells that had never been tested under combat conditions. The possibility that such methods might have unforeseen consequences was dismissed as irrelevant compared to the necessity of ensuring that the prophecy's threat was eliminated permanently and completely. Halloween night 1981 arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that often preceded significant magical events, as if the very atmosphere was preparing itself for forces that would reshape reality, according to principles that normal weather patterns couldn't accommodate. The Potter family's evening routine proceeded with deceptive normalcy, James reading while Lily bathed their son and prepared him for sleep, neither of them aware that their most trusted friend had already provided their enemy with every detail needed to transform their peaceful home into a battlefield. Peter spent that evening in a state of barely controlled panic, knowing that the betrayal he had arranged was about to reach its inevitable conclusion while struggling to maintain the facade of loyalty and concern that had concealed his treachery from people who trusted him absolutely. His rat form provided temporary escape from human emotions too complex and overwhelming to bear, but even animal consciousness couldn't completely eliminate the awareness that he was about to become responsible for consequences that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Voldemort's approach to Godric's Hollow was conducted with the kind of meticulous planning that had made him the most feared wizard of his generation. Every contingency anticipated and prepared for, except the possibility that his own magic might prove inadequate against protections he didn't fully understand. His confidence in the mission's success was absolute, based on intelligence that seemed complete and tactical advantages that appeared overwhelming. The first sign that something was amiss came when the cottage's protective wards, which should have been easily penetrable given the detailed information Peter had provided, proved more resilient than expected. The defenses weren't simply magical barriers, but something approaching living entities that responded to threats with intelligence and adaptability that exceeded anything Voldemort had encountered in previous attacks on protected locations. But these enhanced protections were ultimately insufficient against an enemy whose power and determination exceeded anything they had been designed to counter, and the Dark Lord's assault on the cottage's defenses succeeded in creating breaches that allowed him to proceed with his mission, despite delays and complications that might have discouraged a less committed attacker. The magical explosion that accompanied his entry into the Potter home announced to anyone capable of detecting such emanations that the most dangerous wizard in the world was about to commit murder. James Potter's response to the intrusion was immediate and desperate, his Auror training taking over as he realized that their supposedly perfect concealment had been compromised and that Voldemort himself was approaching through their shattered front door. His shouted warning to Lily reflected both love and tactical necessity, understanding that their son's survival depended on whatever precious seconds his own sacrifice might purchase for his wife to implement whatever desperate measures remained available. The duel between James and Voldemort was brief and utterly one-sided, pitting exceptional but still human magical ability against power that had transcended normal limitations through techniques and transformations that had cost the Dark Lord most of his humanity in exchange for near invincibility, magical combat. James fought with the courage and skill that had made him a legend among his Auror colleagues, but courage and skill were insufficient weapons against someone whose mastery of dark magic exceeded anything that conventional training could prepare him to face. James Potter died as he had lived, protecting people he loved more than his own life, and refusing to surrender even when defeat was certain and resistance was futile. His final spell was cast not in hope of victory, but in determination to delay his enemy long enough for Lily to escape with their son, demonstrating the kind of selfless heroism that had always defined his character. Despite the arrogance and immaturity that had marked his younger years, Lily's desperate flight to Harry's nursery represented her last hope of implementing protective magic that might save her son even if it couldn't preserve her own life, drawing upon ancient spells that required maternal sacrifice to achieve effects that conventional magic could never duplicate. Her knowledge of such techniques came from research she had conducted after learning about the prophecy, understanding that traditional defensive measures would be inadequate against someone of Voldemort's power and determination. The confrontation in Harry's nursery was brief but momentous, as Lily's refusal to stand aside forced Voldemort to kill someone whose death served no tactical purpose beyond clearing his path to the infant who represented the real objective of his mission. Her murder was an act of impatience rather than necessity, eliminating an obstacle whose presence interfered with his ability to complete the task he had come to accomplish. But Lily's death activated protective magic that Voldemort didn't understand and couldn't counter, ancient spells that drew their power from willing sacrifice by someone whose love was pure and absolute. The magical protection that surrounded Harry in the moments before Voldemort attempted to kill him was unlike anything in recorded magical history, representing love, given physical form, and armed with power that could challenge even the darkest magic that had ever been created. The killing curse that Voldemort directed at the infant Harry Potter was cast with the same casual efficiency that had ended hundreds of other lives, carrying magical energy that should have been more than sufficient to destroy someone whose only defense was whatever residual protection his mother's death might have provided. The green light that erupted from the Dark Lord's wand represented the culmination of months of planning and the fulfillment of destiny that prophecy had foretold. But instead of claiming another victim, the curse encountered protection that proved stronger than the magic that had created it, deflecting deadly energy back toward its source with force that exceeded anything Voldemort had ever experienced or imagined possible. The explosion that followed destroyed not just his physical form but the very foundations of his magical existence, reducing the most powerful dark wizard in history to something less than spirit but more than death. Harry Potter survived the encounter with nothing more than a lightning bolt scar on his forehead and the distinction of being the only person in recorded history to survive the killing curse when it was cast with lethal intent by someone capable of channeling its full power. His mother's sacrifice had created protection that would shield him for years to come, but at a cost that left him orphaned before his second birthday and marked by experiences that no child should have to endure. The cottage in Godric's Hollow was left partially destroyed by the magical forces that had been unleashed during Voldemort's attack and subsequent defeat. Its upper story collapsed, and its interior gutted by fires that had burned with supernatural intensity. The scene that awaited anyone who might investigate would tell a clear story of violence and destruction, though the full truth about what had occurred would remain hidden beneath layers of magical concealment and deliberate misdirection. Sirius Black's arrival at the cottage came several hours after the attack, when his growing anxiety about his friend's welfare had finally overcome his commitment to maintaining the security protocols that were supposed to protect all Order members from detection and capture. His journey to Godric's Hollow was conducted in violation of direct orders from Dumbledore, but his concern for James and Lily had reached levels that made rule following seem less important than ensuring their continued safety. The sight that greeted him upon reaching the cottage was everything he had feared and worse than anything he had imagined, confirming that his worst nightmares about the war's potential consequences had proven insufficient to capture the reality of what could happen when protective measures failed and evil succeeded in reaching the people it sought to destroy. The bodies of his best friends lay among the ruins of their home, victims of betrayal that had delivered them to their enemy with precision that suggested intimate knowledge of their circumstances and defenses. Hagrid's presence at the scene reflected Dumbledore's immediate response to magical disturbances that had been detected throughout the wizarding world, as the explosion of protective magic that had destroyed Voldemort's physical form had created emanations that could be sensed by anyone with sufficient sensitivity to such phenomena. The half-giant's mission to rescue Harry from the ruins of his parents' home was conducted with the gentle efficiency that characterized all of his interactions with children who needed protection and care. The conversation between Sirius and Hagrid over Harry's custody represented a conflict between legitimate claims and practical necessities, as Sirius's role as godfather gave him legal and moral rights to care for his best friend's son, while Hagrid's instructions from Dumbledore reflected strategic considerations that extended far beyond simple family relationships. The decision about Harry's placement would determine not just his immediate welfare, but his preparation for challenges that prophecy suggested he would face in years to come. Sirius's surrender of his flying motorcycle to Hagrid represented more than practical assistance with transportation, but symbolic recognition that his role as protector and friend was ending, that the bonds forged during their Hogwarts years were being severed by circumstances beyond anyone's ability to control or repair. His statement that he wouldn't be needing the bike anymore reflected understanding that his future would be defined by consequences that had already been set in motion by betrayal and tragedy. The grief and rage that consumed Sirius as he contemplated the destruction of everything he had valued most in life was intensified by his growing realization that the security breach which had enabled Voldemort's attack could only have come from someone with access to information that should have been known only by the secret keeper. The logical conclusion was as devastating as it was inescapable, forcing him to confront evidence that Peter Pettigrew had betrayed their friendship and their cause in exchange for whatever rewards or protections Voldemort had offered. The hunt for Peter that followed Sirius's departure from Godric's Hollow was conducted with the kind of single-minded determination that comes from grief transformed into purpose, as his need for revenge against the person responsible for James and Lily's deaths overwhelmed every other consideration, including his own safety and the potential consequences of his actions. His tracking of Peter through London streets represented the final act of their friendship, though Peter's betrayal had already transformed what should have been reunion into confrontation. The public street where their final encounter occurred was crowded with muggles who became unwitting witnesses to magical violence that exceeded anything their non-magical experience had prepared them to understand or survive. Peter's choice of such a location reflected tactical calculation, designed to maximize the destruction and confusion that would follow whatever desperate measures he was prepared to take to avoid accountability for his treachery and cowardice. Peter's final performance as victim rather than perpetrator was masterful in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness, transforming himself from betrayer to hero through accusations that no witness could contradict and evidence that would support whatever story he chose to tell about the explosion that was about to claim 13 lives. His shouted declaration that Sirius was the real traitor was calculated to establish a narrative that would explain the violence while concealing his own role in the betrayals that had made such violence necessary. The explosion that Peter created using his wand was precisely calibrated to achieve maximum destruction while ensuring his own survival, eliminating potential witnesses while creating physical evidence that would support his fabricated version of events. The 12 muggles who died in the blast were sacrificed to preserve Peter's secret and establish his false martyrdom, their lives ended by someone whose cowardice had already cost far more than anyone could have imagined. The severed finger that Peter left behind, as proof of his supposed death, was the final detail in a deception that transformed the greatest betrayer in wizarding history into its most celebrated victim, ensuring that his survival would remain secret while his former friends paid the price for crimes he had committed. His transformation into rat form allowed him to escape through sewers and drainage systems where human pursuers couldn't follow, beginning a period of hiding that would last for 12 years. Sirius Black's capture at the scene of destruction was inevitable given the physical evidence that surrounded him and the testimony of witnesses who had heard Peter's accusations before the explosion eliminated any possibility of contradiction. His stunned grief and rage were interpreted as guilt and remorse by people who had no reason to suspect that the obvious explanation for the carnage might be deliberately misleading. The trial that followed was a mockery of justice conducted by people who were too eager for closure to question evidence that seemed overwhelming despite its convenient perfection. Sirius's refusal to defend himself against charges that he knew were false but couldn't disprove without revealing secrets that would endanger other Order members was interpreted as admission of guilt by judges who wanted to believe that such monstrous betrayal could be easily identified and punished. The sentence of life imprisonment in Azkaban represented not just punishment for crimes he hadn't committed, but the destruction of the last surviving link between Harry Potter and the friends who had loved his parents enough to die for them. Sirius's incarceration would leave Harry to grow up among relatives who despised his magical heritage, surrounded by people who could never understand the sacrifices that had preserved his life, or the love that had made those sacrifices possible. The night of October 31st, 1981, marked the end of an era and the beginning of another, transforming four friends whose bond had seemed unbreakable into legend, tragedy, and bitter memory that would haunt the wizarding world for years to come. The Marauders, who had once roamed Hogwarts grounds in animal form, united by friendship that transcended every obstacle, were now scattered by death, imprisonment, and betrayal that had proven stronger than any magic they had learned during their school years. But from the ruins of that friendship would emerge new hope embodied in a child who carried his parents' courage and his mother's love, protected by sacrifices that had created magic powerful enough to defeat the darkest wizard of the age. The story of the Marauders was ending, but the story of Harry Potter was just beginning, and with it would come opportunities for redemption, revenge, and the kind of heroism that honor the memory of those who died, so that others might live in freedom and safety. The fortress of Azkaban rose from the North Sea like a monument to despair, its black stone walls carved from rock that had absorbed centuries of suffering and madness, until the very architecture seemed to radiate hopelessness. Within its cells, Sirius Black endured a form of torment that exceeded physical torture through its systematic assault on memory, hope, and the fundamental sense of self that made existence bearable, rather than merely a prolonged exercise in surviving until the next moment of agony. The Dementors that guarded Azkaban were creatures that fed upon happiness itself, draining joy and hope from their victims, with the methodical efficiency of predators whose hunger could never be satisfied. Their presence transformed the prison into something approaching hell on earth, where the simple act of remembering better times became impossible, as every positive emotion was systematically consumed by entities whose very existence negated the possibility of psychological healing or spiritual redemption. But Sirius possessed advantages that other prisoners lacked, psychological resources that had been forged during years of friendship so profound that not even Dementors could completely eliminate their protective power. His innocence was more than legal technicality but spiritual armor that deflected the worst effects of creatures whose feeding depended upon guilt and despair that he refused to acknowledge as legitimate responses to crimes he had never committed. His animagus transformation provided escape that was partial but precious, as the simpler emotional landscape of dog consciousness offered refuge from human memories that had become too painful to bear without respite. The Dementor's ability to drain happiness was diminished when confronted with animal minds that processed experience through instinct, rather than complex emotional structures that could be systematically dismantled through prolonged exposure to supernatural despair. The years of imprisonment that followed his conviction passed with the grinding inevitability of geological time, each day indistinguishable from those that preceded and followed it, in an endless cycle of suffering that might have broken someone whose commitment to truth was less absolute. But Sirius endured through stubborn refusal to accept responsibility for betrayals he hadn't committed and murders he hadn't ordered, maintaining sanity through obsessive focus on injustice rather than surrender to circumstances that seemed designed to destroy his will to resist. His cell became a world unto itself, a space barely large enough for a human body, but infinite in its capacity to contain memories that grew more precious as they became more dangerous to recall. The friendship he had shared with James Potter, the adventures they had undertaken during their Hogwarts years, the bonds that had seemed strong enough to survive any challenge except betrayal by someone they had trusted completely. These memories sustained him when physical conditions became unbearable, but they also intensified his suffering, by highlighting everything he had lost. The knowledge that Harry Potter was growing up without knowing the truth about his parents' deaths, without understanding the sacrifices that had preserved his life, without access to the love and protection that his godfather could have provided, created additional layers of anguish that Dementors fed upon with particular enthusiasm. Sirius's grief for his godson's stolen childhood was compounded by rage at his own helplessness and despair over justice denied through Peter's masterful deception. The isolation from human contact was perhaps more devastating than the Dementor's presence, as months passed without conversation beyond the minimal exchanges necessary for survival. The other prisoners were too broken or mad to provide companionship, while the guards were either Dementors who communicated only through emanations of despair, or ministry officials whose brief visits were conducted with the efficient coldness of people who viewed him as something less than human. Letters from the outside world were forbidden, ensuring that Sirius remained completely ignorant of events beyond Azkaban's walls during the years when Harry was learning to walk and speak and discover his magical heritage. The possibility that his godson might need guidance or protection from relatives who couldn't understand his nature tormented Sirius with scenarios that grew more elaborate and devastating with each repetition, feeding the very despair that Dementors craved most hungrily. Meanwhile, in the villages and cities of magical Britain, Remus Lupin struggled with different but equally challenging forms of isolation and abandonment. His lycanthropy, which had been manageable during his school years when friendship provided emotional support and practical assistance, became a source of systematic discrimination that closed every door and eliminated every opportunity for the kind of productive life that his intelligence and education should have guaranteed. The employment interviews that followed his graduation from Hogwarts invariably ended the same way, with initial enthusiasm about his academic credentials, giving way to awkward silence and polite rejection once his condition was revealed. Employers who might have been willing to accommodate other forms of magical disability drew the line at lycanthropy, understanding that public discovery of a werewolf on their staff would destroy their reputations and potentially result in boycotts that could ruin businesses built over generations. The jobs that remained available to someone with his stigmatized condition were invariably temporary and degrading, far beneath his qualifications, but representing the only options for someone who needed income to survive in a society that provided no assistance for people whose circumstances made normal employment impossible. Manual labor, cleaning positions, and other work that could be performed by anyone regardless of magical ability or educational background became his entire career horizon. The loneliness was perhaps worse than the poverty, as his transformation schedule made normal social relationships impossible, even when people were willing to overlook his condition. The 3 days surrounding each full moon left him too ill and exhausted to maintain friendships that required regular contact and mutual support, while the psychological toll of his monthly ordeal made him increasingly withdrawn and difficult to be around even during his healthier periods. The knowledge that 2 of his closest friends were dead while the 3rd was imprisoned for betraying them left Remus completely alone with memories that had once brought joy, but now served only to highlight everything he had lost. The Marauders who had once made his transformations bearable through their presence and support were gone, leaving him to face lycanthropy with the same isolation and despair that had characterized his childhood before their friendship had transformed his relationship with his condition. The poverty that accompanied his employment difficulties was both practical hardship and psychological torment. As someone who had grown up in modest comfort and academic privilege, found himself unable to afford basic necessities that others took for granted. The tiny flat he rented in one of London's least desirable neighbourhoods was barely habitable, its walls thin enough that he could hear his neighbours' conversations and arguments its heating inadequate for someone whose monthly transformations left him vulnerable to cold and illness. His possessions gradually disappeared as economic necessity forced him to sell everything that had any value, from books that had been treasures during his student years to personal items that carried sentimental significance but could be exchanged for money needed for rent and food. The process of systematic divestment was emotionally devastating, as each sale represented another connection to his happier past being severed for the sake of bare survival. The medical care that his condition required was expensive and difficult to obtain, as most healers were reluctant to treat lycanthropes due to professional liability concerns and social prejudice that made such patients unwelcome in establishments that served normal wizarding clientele. The specialized potions that could ease his transformation symptoms were costly and often ineffective, leaving him to endure monthly ordeals with nothing more than basic pain relief that barely dulled the agony of his body's restructuring. The social isolation that accompanied his economic struggles was compounded by the gradual erosion of relationships that had survived his initial post-graduation difficulties. Friends from school who had maintained contact despite his condition eventually drifted away as their own lives became more demanding and his problems became more burdensome, leaving him with few people who remembered the person he had been before lycanthropy, and circumstances had worn away everything hopeful and optimistic about his nature. The years of struggle took their toll on both his physical health and psychological resilience, transforming someone who had once been known for gentle humor and scholarly enthusiasm into a man whose wariness and pessimism reflected hard-won understanding that the world was fundamentally hostile to people like him. The transformation was gradual but inexorable, as repeated disappointments and systematic rejection taught him to expect failure and to guard against hope that would only make inevitable defeats more painful. Peter Pettigrew's existence during these same years was characterized by different forms of hiding and deception, as his rat form provided perfect camouflage, but required him to live according to patterns that were psychologically challenging for someone whose human consciousness remained active throughout his animal disguise. The Weasley family's adoption of him as a pet provided security but also constant reminders of the normal family life he had destroyed through his betrayal of people who had trusted him completely. His choice of the Weasley household was calculated rather than accidental, reflecting his understanding that a large wizarding family would provide ideal cover for monitoring developments in the magical world, while remaining close enough to Hogwarts to detect any signs of Voldemort's potential return. The children's affection for their pet rat was touching but also torturous, as their innocent love highlighted the vast difference between the person they believed him to be and the reality of what he had become through his cowardice and treachery. The years spent in rat form were physically comfortable but psychologically nightmarish, as Peter was forced to witness the ordinary domestic happiness that his actions had made impossible for Harry Potter and countless other families affected by the war. The Weasley parents' love for their children, their concern for each other's welfare, their assumption that the people they trusted would never betray them. All of these normal human emotions served as constant reproaches to someone who had chosen survival over loyalty when faced with impossible choices. His access to wizarding news through overheard conversations and discarded newspapers allowed him to monitor the aftermath of his betrayal and the ongoing effects of Voldemort's defeat. The knowledge that Sirius was suffering in Azkaban for crimes that Peter had committed created guilt that was manageable only through elaborate mental gymnastics that portrayed his friend's imprisonment as unfortunate but necessary, consequence of circumstances beyond anyone's control. The gradual recovery of wizarding society from the trauma of Voldemort's first reign provided Peter with evidence that his betrayal might have served the greater good by ending a conflict that could have continued for decades with sane, ever-increasing casualties. He convinced himself that Lily and James would have died eventually anyway, that their deaths had at least contributed to the Dark Lord's defeat and the peace that followed, that his actions had been motivated by wisdom rather than cowardice. But these rationalizations became increasingly difficult to maintain as years passed, and the full scope of his betrayal's consequences became apparent through news reports and overheard conversations. The knowledge that Harry Potter was growing up with relatives who despised his magical nature, that Sirius was slowly going mad in Azkaban, that Remus was struggling with poverty and discrimination. All of these developments could be traced directly to Peter's decision to serve his own survival above friendship and moral obligation. The guilt that accompanied this knowledge was bearable only through constant mental effort that consumed enormous psychological energy, leaving him exhausted and paranoid, even when his circumstances should have provided comfort and security. His rat form became both refuge and prison, offering escape from human emotions too complex to bear while trapping him in a body that prevented him from seeking forgiveness or making amends for damage that couldn't be undone. The nightmares that plagued his sleep were filled with images of friends he had betrayed and consequences he had caused, creating a cycle of fear and self-loathing that made rest impossible and waking hours barely more bearable. The knowledge that he was directly responsible for the destruction of everything good in his life made every moment of safety or comfort feel stolen from people who deserved it more than someone who had purchased survival through betrayal. Harry Potter's childhood among the Dursleys unfolded in ignorance of the magical world that had shaped his destiny before his birth. His relatives' systematic cruelty, designed to eliminate any trace of the heritage that connected him to parents whose memory they despised and feared. The cupboard under the stairs that served as his bedroom was both physical prison and psychological statement about his worth. In the eyes of people who viewed his very existence as unwelcome burden, imposed upon them by circumstances beyond their control. The abuse that Harry suffered was calculated rather than impulsive, reflecting his aunt and uncle's determination to crush any signs of magical ability or independent spirit that might remind them of their connection to a world they neither understood nor wanted to acknowledge. Their treatment of him was designed to create the kind of broken compliance that would prevent him from questioning their authority or seeking alternatives to the life they had constructed for him. The years of systematic neglect and emotional abuse were intended to ensure that Harry would never learn about his true heritage or understand the significance of the scar that marked him as someone special in the wizarding world. The Dursleys' fear of magic was so profound that they were willing to damage their nephew psychologically rather than risk exposure to forces they couldn't control or comprehend. But despite their efforts to eliminate every trace of magic from Harry's environment, his innate abilities occasionally manifested in ways that terrified his relatives, while providing him with glimpses of possibilities beyond their narrow understanding of what life could offer. These accidental displays of magic were met with increasingly severe punishments, designed to teach him that such behavior was unacceptable and dangerous. The isolation that the Dursleys imposed upon Harry was intended to prevent him from forming relationships that might provide alternative perspectives on his worth and potential. Their restrictions on his social contact were motivated by fear that other people might recognize something special about him or encourage him to question the narrative they had constructed about his parents and his own inherent worthlessness. The lies they told him about his parents' deaths were crafted to eliminate any sense of pride or connection to his magical heritage, portraying James and Lily Potter as irresponsible freaks, whose deaths in a car accident had been the inevitable result of their abnormal lifestyle. These fabrications were designed to ensure that Harry would never seek to emulate parents whose actual heroism and sacrifice might have inspired him to develop the kind of courage and moral clarity that the Dursleys found threatening. The 10th anniversary of the Halloween night that had changed everything passed unnoticed by most of the wizarding world, but for those who remembered the true events, It represented a milestone that highlighted how completely their lives had been transformed by betrayal and tragedy. Sirius marked the date in his Azkaban cell with memories too painful to fully recall, while Remus struggled through another lonely day that reminded him of everything he had lost and could never recover. Peter spent that anniversary watching the Weasley family's normal domestic activities, tormented by awareness of the happiness he had destroyed and the innocence he had corrupted through choices that seemed inevitable at the time, but appeared increasingly monstrous with each passing year. The knowledge that Harry Potter was spending the day being mistreated by relatives who couldn't appreciate the miracle of his survival created additional layers of guilt that made his comfortable hiding place feel like a torture chamber. The isolation that defined all of their lives during these years was punctuated only by brief moments of connection that highlighted their fundamental loneliness while providing glimpses of what they had lost. Remus occasionally encountered former classmates who remembered him fondly, but couldn't offer the kind of sustained support that might have made his struggles more bearable, while Sirius existed in complete isolation from everyone who had ever known him as more than a convicted criminal. The approaching end of this period of separation and suffering was heralded by signs that none of them recognized at the time. As Harry Potter's 11th birthday approached, and with it would come revelations that would transform all of their lives once again. The letters from Hogwarts that would soon arrive at Privet Drive would begin the process of reuniting survivors whose paths had been separated by betrayal, but whose destinies remained intertwined through bonds that neither death nor time could completely sever. The years of isolation were ending, though none of them could have anticipated the circumstances that would bring them together again or the new challenges that would test whatever remained of the friendship that had once seemed capable of surviving any obstacle. The Marauders' story was far from over, but its next chapter would unfold in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about loyalty, redemption, and the possibility of healing wounds that seemed too deep to ever fully close. The summer of 1993 brought changes to the wizarding world that seemed to herald a new era of hope and possibility, though beneath the surface of these hopeful developments lay currents of danger and deception that would soon transform apparent progress into renewed conflict. The most significant of these changes was Albus Dumbledore's decision to offer Remus Lupin the position of Defense Against the Dark Arts professor at Hogwarts, ending 12 years of poverty and isolation with an opportunity that seemed almost too good to be true for someone whose condition had made normal employment impossible. The letter that arrived at Remus's shabby London flat was written in Dumbledore's familiar handwriting, its contents both generous and matter-of-fact in their acknowledgement of his lycanthropy, while emphasizing his qualifications for a position that had become notorious for its rapid turnover of occupants. The offer represented more than simple employment, but a chance to return to the place where he had experienced the happiest years of his life, where friendship had transformed his greatest burden into shared adventure, where he might finally find purpose that transcended mere survival. The decision to accept the position was complicated by fears that his condition would eventually be discovered and create scandal that would damage Hogwarts' reputation, while subjecting him to the same kind of public humiliation and rejection that had characterized his post-graduation experiences. But Dumbledore's assurance that appropriate accommodations would be made, combined with Severus Snape's grudging agreement to brew the Wolfsbane potion that would allow him to maintain human consciousness during transformation, made the opportunity too valuable to refuse despite its obvious risks. The preparations for returning to Hogwarts required Remus to confront memories that he had spent years avoiding, as every aspect of the castle's environment carried associations with friends whose loss had never been fully processed or accepted. The thought of walking through corridors where he had once roamed with James, Sirius, and Peter, of teaching in classrooms where they had learned together, of sleeping in quarters that overlooked grounds where they had shared their greatest adventures, was both exhilarating and terrifying in its emotional implications. The journey to Hogwarts aboard the Scarlet steam engine brought unexpected encounters that would prove significant beyond anything Remus could have anticipated, as his compartment became the refuge for Harry Potter and his friends when Dementors boarded the train in search of an escaped prisoner whose identity remained unknown to most passengers. The first sight of James Potter's son was profoundly moving for someone who had loved the boy's parents and mourned their loss every day for 12 years. Harry's resemblance to his father was striking but incomplete, his mother's green eyes providing a constant reminder of the sacrifice that had preserved his life, while his general appearance evoked memories of friendship and loss that were almost overwhelming in their intensity. The opportunity to protect James and Lily's son from the Dementors' attack felt like a form of redemption, allowing Remus to finally provide the kind of assistance that might honor their memory and serve their child's welfare. The chocolate that Remus offered Harry after the Dementor encounter was more than simple medical treatment, but a gesture of care that connected the present moment to years of friendship, when such small acts of kindness had been routine, expressions of mutual support and affection. The knowledge that Harry had no memory of his parents' love made every opportunity to demonstrate care on their behalf seem precious and significant. Meanwhile, the escape from Azkaban that had prompted the Dementors' search of the Hogwarts Express represented the culmination of years of planning and preparation that had been conducted entirely within the confines of Sirius Black's prison cell. The discovery of Peter Pettigrew's survival had provided motivation that transformed despair into determination, giving him reason to attempt what had previously been considered impossible, even for someone with his exceptional abilities and resources. The photograph in the Daily Prophet that had revealed Peter's survival among the Weasley family was more than simple intelligence, but proof that the betrayal which had destroyed everything Sirius valued had been even more complete and devastating than he had realized. The knowledge that his supposed victim had been living comfortable and safe, while he endured 12 years of torment in Azkaban, created rage so intense that it temporarily overcame even the Dementors' ability to drain emotion and hope from their victims. The escape itself was accomplished through careful exploitation of advantages that other prisoners lacked, as his animagus form allowed him to slip between bars that were designed to contain human bodies, while his innocence provided psychological armor against the despair that kept most inmates from even attempting to flee their captivity. The transformation into dog form was accomplished during a period when the Dementors were distracted by routine prisoner transfers, creating a window of opportunity that lasted only minutes, but proved sufficient for someone who had planned every detail of his breakout. The journey from Azkaban to the Scottish Highlands was conducted entirely in animal form, as his dog consciousness provided protection against the psychological trauma of freedom, while his enhanced senses allowed him to navigate toward Hogwarts without being detected by the massive manhunt that was mobilized to recapture the placed, most dangerous escaped prisoner in the history of the wizarding prison system. The weeks of travel were marked by near starvation and constant vigilance, but also by growing anticipation of the confrontation that would finally allow him to expose the truth about Peter's betrayal and his own innocence. His arrival at Hogwarts coincided with the beginning of term, when the castle's population of students and staff provided both opportunities for concealment and increased risks of discovery by people who would recognize him despite his animal disguise. The grounds he had once known intimately had been altered by years of growth and change, but the essential geography remained familiar enough that he could navigate toward his objectives without revealing his presence to casual observers. The knowledge that Harry Potter was now a student at the school added complexity to his mission that went beyond simple revenge against Peter, as his godfather's responsibilities required him to consider the boy's welfare and safety, while pursuing justice for crimes that had destroyed their family. The possibility that his presence might endanger Harry was balanced against the certainty that Peter's continued freedom represented an ongoing threat to anyone who might eventually discover his true identity and past actions. Peter Pettigrew's reaction to news of Sirius's escape was immediate and overwhelming panic that transformed his comfortable existence as the Weasley family pet into a nightmare of constant fear and paranoia. The knowledge that someone who knew his true identity was free and presumably seeking revenge made every moment of safety feel temporary, and every sound potentially herald approaching doom that he couldn't escape or prevent. The deterioration of his physical condition during the months following Sirius's breakout was attributed by his human family to illness or aging, but actually reflected the psychological stress of someone who understood that his years of successful deception were about to end in exposure that would reveal not just his survival, but his responsibility for crimes that had made him the faucher, most wanted fugitive in Wizarding Britain. His attempts to flee the Weasley household were frustrated by magical protections around the burrow that prevented unauthorized departures, while his rat form's limitations made independent travel dangerous and potentially fatal for someone whose animal body was neither large enough nor hardy enough to survive extended periods away from human care and protection. The trap that his own deception had created was becoming a prison that offered no escape from approaching consequences. The reunion of 3 surviving Marauders in the Shrieking Shack represented the culmination of 12 years of separation, betrayal, and suffering that had transformed childhood friends into something approaching mythical figures whose personal conflicts carried implications far beyond their individual relationships. The setting was appropriate for such a confrontation, as the abandoned house had once been the site of their greatest triumph over adversity and their deepest expression of loyalty and mutual support. Remus's arrival at the shack was prompted by his observation of the Marauders' map, a magical artifact whose creation represented their collaborative achievement at its finest, but whose current revelations suggested disaster that could destroy everything positive that might remain from their shared history. The sight of Peter Pettigrew's name moving through Hogwarts corridors was both vindication of Sirius's claims and confirmation of betrayal so profound that it challenged every assumption about friendship and trust that had shaped their understanding of human relationships. The confrontation between Sirius and Peter was charged with emotions that had been building for over a decade, as years of imprisonment and suffering met face to face with cowardice and treachery that had caused incalculable damage to innocent people. The accusations and counter-accusations that flew between them reflected not just personal grievances, but fundamental disagreements about loyalty, courage, and the moral obligations that friends owed to each other under extreme circumstances. Peter's defense of his actions revealed psychological patterns that had been present during their school years, but had been overlooked or minimized by friends who had focused on his loyalty rather than questioning its foundations or sustainability under pressure. His claim that he had been forced to betray them was contradicted by evidence of extensive planning and voluntary communication with Voldemort's representatives that suggested calculation rather than coercion. The revelation of Animagi's transformations to Harry Potter and his friends represented the sharing of secrets that had been central to the Marauders' identity, while demonstrating magical achievements that exceeded anything normally expected from students their age. The knowledge that respected adults had spent years as unregistered Animagi, in violation of ministry regulations, provided perspective on rule-breaking that challenged assumptions about authority and legal obligation. Sirius's explanation of the events surrounding the Potter family's betrayal was delivered with the kind of detailed accuracy that could only come from someone who had lived with the consequences of those events every day for 12 years. Understanding not just what had happened, but why it had occurred, and how different choices might have produced different outcomes. His account revealed the complexity of decisions that had seemed simple at the time but had proven catastrophically flawed in their assumptions about human nature and loyalty. The evidence that Peter had been the secret keeper, rather than Sirius, transformed understanding of the betrayal from straightforward treachery by a trusted friend into elaborate deception that had involved multiple layers of misdirection and strategic planning, designed to ensure that the real traitor would remain hidden while someone else paid the price for his crimes. The sophistication of the plan suggested intelligence and cunning that his former friends had never suspected he possessed. Remus's reaction to these revelations was complicated by his own guilt over suspicions he had harbored about Sirius during the war, doubts that had been based on reasonable analysis of available evidence, but which now seemed like additional betrayals of friendship that should have been stronger than circumstantial concerns about loyalty and commitment. His apology to Sirius acknowledged not just mistaken beliefs, but failure to trust someone whose character should have been beyond question. The decision to kill Peter rather than deliver him to Ministry justice reflected understanding that the wizarding legal system had already proven inadequate to deal with his crimes and might prove unable to convict him of offenses that had been so successfully concealed through his masterful deception. The summary execution would serve both justice and revenge, while ensuring that he couldn't escape again to continue causing harm to people who had already suffered more than anyone should be asked to bear. Harry Potter's intervention to prevent Peter's murder demonstrated moral courage that exceeded his years while reflecting values that his parents would have recognized and approved, despite their own desires for revenge against someone who had destroyed their family. His argument that James Potter wouldn't have wanted his best friends to become murderers carried weight that transcended practical considerations about justice and punishment. The irony of Peter owing his life to the mercy shown by James Potter's son was lost on no one present, as the very person whose parents he had betrayed to their deaths was now protecting him from consequences that most observers would have considered entirely appropriate. The life debt that resulted from Harry's intervention would prove significant in ways that none of them could have anticipated at the time. The journey back toward the castle was conducted in an atmosphere of tentative hope and reconciliation, as Sirius and Remus began to rebuild their friendship while making plans for Harry's future that assumed the truth about Peter's betrayal would soon be revealed to Ministry authorities. The possibility that Sirius might be exonerated and freed to serve as Harry's guardian represented a form of justice that seemed almost too good to be true after so many years of suffering and separation. But the full moon that rose during their return journey transformed hope into disaster, as Remus's failure to take his wolfsbane potion resulted in lycanthropic transformation that endangered everyone present while providing Peter with failure the opportunity for escape that he had been seeking since. Sirius's breakout from Azkaban, the chaos that followed, demonstrated how quickly circumstances could change and how previous victories could be transformed into defeats through factors beyond anyone's ability to predict or control. Sirius's transformation into dog form to combat the werewolf that his friend had become represented, both instinctive, protective response and tragic irony, as the Animagus abilities that had once allowed them to support Remus during his transformations now forced him to fight someone he loved in order to protect innocent bystanders from lycanthropic violence. The battle between dog and werewolf was brief but vicious, ending with both participants injured and exhausted. Peter's escape during the confusion was accomplished with the same cunning and opportunistic calculation that had characterized his original betrayal, as he recognized that the chaos provided cover for transformation into rat form and flight into environments where human pursuers couldn't follow effectively. His disappearance ensured that the truth about past events would remain unproven despite the testimony of witnesses whose credibility would be questioned by authorities reluctant to admit their previous mistakes. The Dementor attack that followed represented the final disaster in a series of setbacks that transformed what should have been triumph into tragedy, as the soul-sucking creatures attempted to perform the kiss that would eliminate Sirius's consciousness while leaving his body alive but empty. The magical protection that Harry provided through his Patronus charm saved his godfather's life while demonstrating power that exceeded anything normally expected from someone his age and experience level. The aftermath of that night's events left all survivors exhausted and traumatized, while Peter's successful escape ensured that official vindication remained impossible, despite the truth having been revealed to multiple witnesses. Sirius's continued status as fugitive meant that his relationship with Harry would have to be conducted in secrecy and constant danger of discovery by authorities who remained convinced of his guilt. The bonds between the surviving Marauders had been partially restored through shared crisis and revealed truth, but the full reconciliation that might have been possible was prevented by circumstances that forced them back into hiding and separation. Remus's resignation from his teaching position was necessitated by public discovery of his lycanthropy, while Sirius's need to remain hidden limited his ability to provide the kind of guidance and support that Harry desperately needed. The night in the Shrieking Shack had revealed truth but failed to deliver justice, restored friendship but couldn't repair all the damage that 12 years of separation and betrayal had caused, and demonstrated that the bonds forged during their Hogwarts years retained power to survive even the most devastating challenges to loyalty and trust. The Marauders' story was far from over, but its next chapter would unfold against the backdrop of renewed conflict as dark forces began stirring once again throughout the wizarding world. The restoration of Voldemort's physical form marked the beginning of a new phase in the conflict that had shaped the wizarding world for over a decade, as the Dark Lord's return brought with it a hunger for revenge that extended far beyond simple conquest to encompass personal vendettas against everyone who had contributed to his previous defeat. Peter Pettigrew's role in the resurrection ritual was both triumph and tragedy, as his successful completion of the task that had consumed his exile earned him rewards that came at costs he hadn't anticipated when he first chose treachery over loyalty. The silver hand that Voldemort provided as replacement for the flesh and blood that Peter had sacrificed contained magic far more powerful than his original limb, but also carried enchantments that reflected the Dark Lord's understanding of his servant's fundamental character and potential for future betrayal. The hand was simultaneously gift and curse, providing supernatural strength while ensuring that its bearer remained bound to his master through magical compulsions that made rebellion impossible and disobedience potentially fatal. The return of Lord Voldemort to full power triggered the reformation of the Order of the Phoenix, as Albus Dumbledore recognized that the threat they now faced exceeded anything from the previous war due to the enemy's enhanced understanding of their methods and his determination to eliminate everyone who had contributed to his precinct's temporary defeat. The organization that reassembled was older, more experienced, but also smaller and more cautious than its original incarnation, shaped by painful lessons about the costs of resistance and the reality of loss in warfare against enemies who showed no mercy. Sirius Black's participation in the Reformed Order represented both redemption and renewed commitment to principles that had defined his character since his rejection of his family's dark allegiances during his Hogwarts years. His years in Azkaban had refined his understanding of justice and injustice, while strengthening his resolve to protect innocent people from the kind of suffering he had endured through false accusation and systematic persecution by corrupt authority figures. The headquarters established at Grimmauld Place was chosen not just for its defensive capabilities, but for its symbolic significance, as Sirius's family home represented everything he had rejected while providing resources that could be turned toward purposes his ancestors would have found abhorrent. The conversion of a shrine to pure blood supremacy into a base for resistance against the very forces his family had once supported represented a form of poetic justice that appealed to his sense of irony while serving practical needs. Remus Lupin's return to active service with the Order reflected his understanding that the personal costs of his lycanthropy were insignificant compared to the collective threat that Voldemort's return represented for all magical beings who didn't conform to narrow definitions of place, acceptable existence. His missions within werewolf communities required him to associate with creatures whose desperation and rage had made them susceptible to recruitment by promises of revenge against the society that had rejected them. The intelligence that Remus gathered during these dangerous assignments revealed the scope of Voldemort's recruitment efforts among magical creatures who had been marginalized by mainstream wizarding society, as the Dark Lord exploited legitimate grievances to build alliances with groups whose support could provide tactical advantages while serving his broader strategy of dividing and conquering his opposition. The information came at enormous personal cost, requiring Remus to witness planning for atrocities while maintaining cover that prevented him from warning intended victims. The relationship that developed between Remus and Nymphadora Tonks during this period began as professional collaboration, but gradually evolved into something deeper and more personal, as their shared commitment to protecting innocent people created emotional bonds that transcended the professional distance normally maintained between Order operatives. Tonks's metamorphmagus abilities made her invaluable for infiltration and surveillance missions, but her irreverent humor and optimistic nature provided psychological support that helped Remus maintain sanity during the dark period of renewed warfare. Their courtship was conducted against the backdrop of constant danger and interrupted by missions that separated them for weeks at a time, creating urgency that intensified every moment they could spend together, while highlighting the uncertainty that characterized all relationships during wartime. The love that grew between them was tested by circumstances that made normal romantic development impossible, but it also demonstrated the power of human connection to survive even the most challenging external pressures. The battles that erupted during the early phases of the Second Wizarding War were characterized by tactics that had evolved beyond the straightforward terrorism of Voldemort's first reign to encompass psychological warfare designed to break the will of anyone who might consider resistance. The enemy's methods included not just murder and torture, but systematic campaigns of intimidation that targeted families and communities rather than individual opponents. Sirius's death during the Battle of the Department of Mysteries represented the kind of loss that the Reformed Order had been created to prevent, as someone whose survival of Azkaban should have guaranteed him the opportunity for redemption and reconciliation, was instead claimed by violence that reflected both his courage and the enemy's determination to eliminate anyone whose existence challenged their narratives about justice and punishment. The confrontation with his cousin Bellatrix Lestrange was inevitable given their shared history and opposed allegiances, but it also represented the collision between different responses to pure-blood heritage and family expectations, where Sirius had chosen rejection of dark traditions in favor of principles that transcended blood status. Bellatrix had embraced the most extreme expressions of supremacist ideology while abandoning every restraint that civilization imposed on the exercise of magical power. The killing curse that ended Sirius's life was cast with malicious pleasure rather than simple tactical necessity, reflecting Bellatrix's enjoyment of inflicting suffering on family members who had chosen different paths through life. His death was both personal tragedy and strategic setback for the Order, eliminating someone whose knowledge of pure blood society and connections within ancient families had provided crucial intelligence about enemy operations and recruitment efforts. Harry Potter's reaction to his godfather's death was complicated by guilt over decisions that had led to the confrontation, rage at enemies who had claimed someone he had only recently learned to love, and grief for the future relationship that would never develop beyond the brief moments of connection they had managed to share despite constant danger and separation. The loss represented not just personal tragedy, but the severing of his last direct connection to parents whose love had preserved his life, but whose memory remained frustratingly incomplete. Remus's response to Sirius's death was shaped by years of experience with loss and betrayal that had taught him to channel grief into determination rather than allowing it to paralyze his ability to continue fighting for causes that transcended individual survival. His role as the last surviving Marauder carried obligations that extended beyond personal mourning to encompass responsibility for preserving the values and relationships that had defined their friendship despite its ultimate destruction through betrayal and violence. The marriage between Remus and Tonks occurred during a brief lull in the conflict, when both recognized that waiting for safer circumstances might mean never experiencing the happiness that their love could provide. The ceremony was small and private, conducted with the understanding that their future together was uncertain, but that the commitment they were making transcended immediate circumstances to encompass whatever challenges they might face as partners rather than individuals. The pregnancy that followed represented both hope and vulnerability, as the possibility of new life offered evidence that love could triumph over death while creating additional responsibilities that complicated their participation in dangerous missions. Tonks's condition required adjustments to operational planning that reflected the Order's commitment to protecting its members, while maintaining effectiveness against enemies who showed no concern for the welfare of their own followers. Remus's initial response to impending fatherhood was complicated by fears that his lycanthropy might be passed to his child, creating another generation cursed with conditions that made normal social integration impossible. His temporary abandonment of Tonks reflected psychological crisis rather than lack of love, as he struggled with the possibility that his selfishness in pursuing happiness might result in suffering for innocent people who deserved better than the limitations his nature imposed. Harry's confrontation with Remus about his responsibilities as husband and father demonstrated moral courage that exceeded his years while reflecting values that his parents would have recognized and approved despite the harsh circumstances that made such judgment necessary. The argument that followed revealed the depth of Remus's internal conflict while forcing him to confront the reality that running away from obligations wouldn't eliminate the consequences of choices already made. The reconciliation that brought Remus back to his family was facilitated by his understanding that love required courage to accept vulnerability rather than seeking safety through emotional distance. His decision to embrace fatherhood despite his fears reflected growth that had been fostered through years of friendship and loss, teaching him that the risks of loving someone were always outweighed by the emptiness of isolation and self-protection. The birth of Edward Remus Lupin brought joy to a family that had been shaped by war but refused to be defined by conflict, as the arrival of new life represented hope for a future that might transcend the violence and hatred that had characterized their present circumstances. The child, who would be known as Teddy, carried the potential for healing wounds that had seemed permanent while providing his parents with motivation that extended beyond abstract principles to encompass concrete responsibility for specific, innocent life. The final phases of the war saw Peter Pettigrew stationed at Malfoy Manor, where his presence served both practical and symbolic purposes, as Voldemort consolidated power while preparing for ultimate confrontation with forces that continued to resist his authority. Peter's role as guard and interrogator reflected his complete transformation from someone who had once sought protection through friendship into an instrument of the very evil he had originally feared. The encounter between Peter and Harry Potter in the cellar of Malfoy Manor represented the collision between mercy shown years earlier and consequences that had developed through choices made in the intervening period. Harry's reminder that Peter owed him a life debt activated magical obligations that transcended personal loyalty or fear of punishment, demonstrating that some forms of magic operated according to principles that even Voldemort couldn't completely control or corrupt. Peter's death at the hands of his own magical hand was both fitting punishment for betrayal that had destroyed countless lives and tragic waste of potential that might have been directed toward redemption if he had possessed the possessed courage to seek forgiveness rather than continuing to serve evil out of fear and cowardice. The silver hand that strangled him represented the ultimate expression of Voldemort's distrust of his followers, as even rewards carried the potential for punishment when loyalty was questioned. The manner of Peter's death was witnessed by Harry Potter, whose attempts to save someone who had betrayed his parents demonstrated moral principles that transcended personal desire for revenge. His intervention was unsuccessful but significant, proving that the capacity for mercy survived even the most extreme provocation, while highlighting the difference between justice and vengeance that characterized the fundamental conflict between good and evil. The Battle of Hogwarts represented the final confrontation between forces that had been gathering strength for months, as Voldemort's assault on the school brought together everyone who had chosen sides in a conflict that would determine the future of magical society. The stakes extended beyond simple victory or defeat to encompass questions about what kind of world would emerge from the destruction and whether the values that had motivated resistance would survive the costs of defending them. Remus Lupin's participation in the battle was motivated by determination to create a world where his son could grow up free from the prejudice and fear that had defined his own life, understanding that the fight was no longer about abstract principles, but about concrete responsibility for the next generation's welfare and opportunities. His final mission represented the culmination of a lifetime spent defending people who couldn't protect themselves while seeking acceptance in a society that had never fully embraced his existence. The duel between Remus and Antonin Dolohov was brief but decisive, pitting someone who fought for love against someone who served hatred with equally absolute commitment. The curse that killed Remus was cast by someone whose understanding of dark magic exceeded normal human limitations, but it was met by defensive spells that had been refined through years of protecting innocent people from exactly such attacks. Remus's death occurred in the same castle where he had experienced the happiest years of his life, surrounded by the magic and memories that had shaped his character, while defending values that had been forged during adolescent friendships that had survived betrayal and loss to inspire continued resistance against overwhelming odds. His final sacrifice was witnessed by students and colleagues who understood that they were seeing the end of an era and the completion of a journey that had begun with 4 boys, discovering the power of true friendship. The appearance of James Potter, Sirius Black, and Remus Lupin through the Resurrection Stone represented more than magical curiosity, but spiritual reunion that transcended physical death to demonstrate the persistence of love and loyalty beyond the grave. Their presence during Harry's walk toward what appeared to be certain death provided comfort that connected present sacrifice to past friendships, while offering evidence that some bonds survived every form of destruction. The conversation between Harry and the spirits of his father's friends revealed the depth of their continued concern for his welfare, while acknowledging the inevitability of the choice he was making to protect others through willing sacrifice. Their assurance that death was merely transition rather than ending provided courage that enabled him to face Voldemort without fear, while understanding that his action was continuation of protection that had begun with his parents' love and continued through the dedication of everyone who had chosen to fight for his survival. James Potter's promise that they would remain with Harry until the end of his ordeal reflected paternal love that death couldn't diminish, while providing reassurance that his sacrifice would not be made in isolation but supported by spiritual presence of everyone who had loved him enough to die for his protection. The commitment represented not just emotional support but magical assistance that would help him survive what appeared to be impossible circumstances. Sirius's observation that dying was quicker than falling asleep offered comfort based on personal experience, while reflecting his understanding that physical death was less significant than the spiritual victory that Harry's willing sacrifice would achieve. His presence during those final moments represented redemption of promises made years earlier when he had offered to serve as godfather and protector. Remus's concern for his son demonstrated that parental love survived death, while his confidence that Teddy would eventually understand his parents' sacrifice reflected faith in the next generation's ability to comprehend the Baga, values that had motivated such extreme dedication. His spiritual presence during Harry's final walk represented the completion of protection that had begun when four friends decided that loyalty was more important than personal safety. The final reunion of the Marauders in spiritual form represented the triumph of friendship over every obstacle that had challenged their bond, as death revealed the ultimate truth that love and loyalty were the only forces powerful enough to survive the destruction of everything else they had valued. Their collective presence during the war's climactic moment demonstrated that the bonds forged during their Hogwarts years had been strong enough to transcend betrayal, imprisonment, exile, and death itself. The legacy they left to the next generation was embodied in Harry Potter's survival and the defeat of forces that had threatened to destroy everything good and decent about magical society. Their sacrifice had purchased peace that would allow children like Teddy Lupin to grow up free from the fear and hatred that had shaped their parents' lives, creating possibilities for happiness that earlier generations had been unable to achieve despite their best efforts and ultimate dedication. The story of the Marauders ended not with despair but with victory achieved through sacrifice, demonstrating that friendship powerful enough to motivate such dedication could overcome any enemy and survive any loss. Their names would be remembered not just as casualties of war but as heroes whose love for each other had inspired the kind of courage that made final victory possible despite overwhelming odds and heartbreaking costs. And so ends the tale of the Marauders, four boys who became legends through friendship that transcended even death itself. From their innocent beginnings in Hogwarts dormitories to their heroic ends protecting the future they believed in, James, Sirius, Remus, and Peter showed us that the bonds forged in youth can shape destinies and change the world. Though their earthly journey ended in sacrifice and sorrow, their legacy lives on in the boy they all loved, Harry Potter, who carried their courage, their love, and their spirit into the light. James Potter, whose arrogance became humility and whose love became protection. Sirius Black, who chose loyalty over blood and friendship over safety. Remus Lupin, whose burden became strength and whose gentleness became fierce determination. Even Peter Pettigrew, whose fear led to betrayal, but whose final moments contained the spark of conscience that saved the very person whose parents he had doomed. Each played their part in a story larger than any individual life, where every choice mattered and every sacrifice had meaning. As you drift toward peaceful dreams, remember that true friendship like theirs never truly dies. It lives in every act of loyalty, every moment of sacrifice for others, every choice to stand against darkness, even when the cost is everything. Sleep now, knowing that somewhere in the realm of dreams and memory, 4 friends run together once more through moonlit castle grounds, their laughter echoing through eternity, their bond unbroken by time or tragedy. Sweet dreams, young wizard, and may you find friendships as deep and lasting as the Marauders who watch over us still.